Chapter 582. Surrounded by dust, Eureka's little finger quickly hooked, and the dagger on the other side of the leg quickly fell into his hand. He held it backhand and hammered it down. Puff! It penetrated into the ear of the giant walking dead. The giant walking dead trembled and stopped moving immediately. Eureka exhaled softly and pulled out the dagger. At the same time, he took out the other dagger from its neck. The two daggers rubbed against each other to remove the frozen blood on the daggers. Then he put them back into the leggings. Seeing that the giant walking dead was solved, the three young men with stone-gray hair breathed a sigh of relief and immediately stepped forward. The general is brave. The general is so powerful that he can solve a giant walking dead without using the magic weapon. When the three complimented, Dean glanced at the giant walking dead and said to Eureka, "Won't you take out the cold crystal in its head?" Hearing this, the three turned to look at him. Eureka glanced at Dean and said, "If you want to take it yourself, this thing is useless to me." Good. Dean was waiting for these words. He immediately pulled out the dagger and came to the giant walking dead's body. He stabbed along the wound caused by Eureka, trying to cut its skull first, but found that its skull was extremely hard, no less than tungsten steel, and his dagger could not pry it open a little. He was shocked in his heart. The skull was so hard. If it was him, it was almost impossible to kill this giant walking dead. Eureka saw that Dean was busy for a long time, but still couldn't cut the head of the giant walking dead. He shook his head slightly and said, "It's impossible to hurt it with your dagger." Then he pulled out the dagger tied to his leg, squatted down, and quickly slashed it, and soon the giant walking dead's head was split into several pieces. "Thank you," Dean said, and immediately opened its skull. Suddenly, a burst of white cold air came out, freezing the palm, especially the left arm. Under the stimulation of this cold air, the cold air in the arm seemed to be active, swimming toward the body. He hurriedly controlled the heartbeat and suppressed it with dragon blood technique. Soon, the active cold air was suppressed by him. At this time, the white chill in the skull of the giant walking dead gradually drifted away, revealing the brain inside, which had been completely frozen like a dark red ice ball. Dean slightly frowned and used the dagger to cut it. Fortunately, the ice ball was not as hard as its skull. It was quickly cut open, revealing an oval dark blue crystal inside. He reached out and picked it up. The crystal was so cold that his fingertips stung from the cold. He focused his gaze and saw that there was a worm-like contour in the ice crystal. "Let's go," Eureka said after Dean picked up the cold crystal. Dean's eyes lit up. He put away the cold crystal and got up to catch up. Eureka walked slowly, as if he was not in a hurry. He looked around and was alert for unknown dangers. After all, even pioneers could die in the barren area, so he had to be careful. Half an hour later, Eureka sat down on a pile of stones and said, "Let's take a break here." The three of them stopped immediately. The blonde woman immediately opened her backpack and took out a bottle of purified water from it. She trotted to Eureka and handed it to him with both hands, saying, "General, here you are." Eureka glanced at her and said indifferently, "No, I have my own." After that, he opened his backpack and took out the purified water from it. The blonde woman withdrew her hand in embarrassment, excused herself, and turned back to the other two. The three of them sat on a pile of stones next to them, taking out dry food and water to replenish their physical strength while guarding around. Dean went directly to Eureka and sat down, so that he could react in time if there was any danger. After resting for more than 10 minutes, Eureka still didn't mean to get up. Instead, he said to the blonde woman and the other two, "We will sleep here tonight. Get ready to sprinkle the walking dead powder." The three of them were surprised and looked at each other, but they didn't say anything. They bowed their heads and prepared the defense work of the camp according to his instructions. "It's still early now. Don't you want to walk more?" Dean looked at him in surprise. Eureka shrugged and said, "This mission is to take you out to take refuge, not to hunt monsters. There is no need to walk more. If I were not worried about being caught up by the people sent by Her Highness Hathaway, I would like to camp directly beside the flag in the wasteland. Dean was slightly stunned and thought so he didn't say anything more. Time passed quickly. In a blink of an eye, Dean and others had been in the 2nd District of the Red Wasteland for 3 days. In these 3 days, Eureka took Dean and others to wander in the outer edge of the 2nd District of the Red Wasteland. They did not go deep into the unexplored depth area to avoid encountering monsters to the greatest extent. Nevertheless, in these 3 days, they still encountered several giant walking dead, as well as some weaker sickle walking dead, and a large number of ordinary walking dead, all of which were killed by Eureka and the blonde woman. Dean never made a move from beginning to end. He was closely protected by several people, and he was happy to do so. I didn't expect that there are so many high-level walking dead in the outer edge area that has been cleaned. Eureka frowned slightly, stabbed a dagger, killed a sickle walking dead, shook the blood on the dagger, and turned to look around. The blonde woman heard his words, turned her eyes, and said, "General, most of these high-level walking dead wandered from the deep area that has not been cleaned, right? Do you need to say that?" Eureka snorted coldly, looked up at the direction of the deep red area in the distance, and frowned slightly. A large number of walking dead wandered. Was there something in the deep area that scared them? Thinking of this, his heart was a little gloomy, and he turned and said, "Go back. It's too deep here." The blonde woman and the other 2 looked at each other. They were still deep here? If they retreated again, they would leave the 2nd District of the Red Wasteland. Although thinking so, the 3 people still obediently followed Eureka and left, sheltering Dean in the middle of the team. Soon, the crowd retreated 4 or 5 miles away. Eureka saw that they had retreated almost and stopped and said, "It's here. Get ready. We will camp here tonight." The blonde woman and the other 2 had no objection. They immediately circled the ground, set the alarm, and sprinkled walking dead powder. Dean sat idly on the pile of stones, glancing around in case of a monster drilling into the ground. Suddenly, he heard a faint wind in his ear. He couldn't help but look at the source of the sound, but saw that it came from a gap in a pile of stones next to him. Dean was surprised. There was wind in the pile of stones? Was there space below? Or, this is the wind of the monster breathing? There is movement. Dean immediately said to Eureka, "Under this pile of stones." Eureka, who was sitting on the pile of stones to rest, was slightly surprised. He looked in the direction of Dean's finger and listened. Suddenly, he heard a faint sound of airflow. He could not help but look at it. He pulled out the dagger beside his leg, quietly touched it, and slowly broke the stone. After a while, the pile of stones was broken, and it was dark inside. He threw a few stones into it one after another. He heard a burst of rolling sound, but there was no movement of the monster's counterattack, and the faint sound of airflow was still there. Seeing this, he was relieved, knowing that it was not the breath of the monster, but there was a ventilation below. He broke the stone and continued to walk inside. Anyway, he had come here, and it didn't matter to walk a few more steps. Besides, he was a little curious about where the ventilation below came from. Soon, the pile of stones was broken, revealing a passage, and he walked inside. Duddian immediately caught up with her. The blonde woman and the other 2, who were setting up the alarm, saw the action of the 2 and immediately followed, in case they stayed outside and encountered danger. The 5 people went straight down the passage under the pile of stones. The road was full of gravel, and it was easy to sprain their feet. After more than 50 meters, the gravel disappeared, and a flat road appeared in front of them. The ground was horizontal, as if it was artificially cast. Dean looked up, and suddenly his pupil shrank. He saw more than 20 meters at the end of the road. There was a huge stone door. If it were not for a gap in the middle of the stone door and the stone pattern on the stone door, he almost thought it was a rock wall. Chapter 583. The 7th District of the Red Wasteland. In the gray and turbid sky, 2 giant wings swept through the sky at a high speed. The figure inlaid in the middle of the giant wings was slender and slender, carrying a giant sword that did not match the body proportion. Every time the wings flapped, the whistling sound of the wind could be heard even on the ground hundreds of meters below. In the high speed forward, Aisha's eyes moved left and right, patrolling around. Despite the high-speed movement, the things on the ground were still presented in her vision. Dynamic vision, superimposed heating vision, coupled with high-power vision, her eyes could see every rotten hole on the gravel on the ground. Roar! Roar! Where her figure passed, there were groups of walking dead wandering on the ground. When they heard the movement above their heads, they roared up to the sky, waving their sharp arms and running in the direction of Aisha's flying. Until her figure was lost in the field of vision, they slowly returned to the wandering state. Well, suddenly, Aisha's eyes narrowed and fell on one of the messy gravel. There were 2 huge footprints on the ground here, and there was a long dent behind the footprints, as if it had been crushed by a giant python. Found it! Aisha's eyes lit up, and she looked forward along the footprints, only to see the footprints spread forward along the gravel to the distance. She immediately flew behind the footprints and chased at a high speed. 10 minutes later, Aisha, who was flying at full speed, suddenly stopped in the air. Her calm face was full of shock, and she looked at a place in front of her in horror. The ground was messy. There were huge craters in the shape of meteorites everywhere, and countless walking dead were lying in the huge craters. The types of these walking dead were strange. There were the most common walking dead, and there were sickle walking dead, one-horned walking dead, giant walking dead, and other high-level walking dead. At this moment, all the bodies were broken, and the heads were almost all destroyed. Only a few walking dead bodies were cut at the waist, and the upper body was still crawling in the pile of corpses, making a clicking sound. However, Aisha's trembling eyes fell on one of the huge craters. There was a huge corpse, or rather, a skeleton, lying there quietly. The flesh on the surface of the corpse had been eaten up, revealing the huge skeleton. At this moment, there were still 7 or 8 walking dead that were cut at the waist, desperately gnawing the remaining flesh. This corpse was an extremely large monster. Just the length of the skeleton from the head to the soles of the feet was about 12 to 13 meters. There was also a 10-meter-long tail that had been gnawed and torn. Its skeleton was extremely ferocious. Other than the spine in the middle, which was extremely thick and strong, the ribs and scaffolding that extended from the spine to the sides were also extremely strong and extended to the left and right. It could be seen that the width of its body was at least 7 or 8 meters. How? Aisha stared at the skeleton. Her heart was shocked. Wasn't this the executioner she was looking for? He was actually dead. She couldn't accept this fact. The executioner's head-on combat ability was not as weak as the Shadow Hunter. Judging from its size, this executioner had obviously reached the mature stage. This was a legendary monster, second only to the Dream Breeder, and it was much stronger than her magic-marked demonic dragon. How could it die here? She was stunned for a long time. Suddenly, her eyes noticed a few corpses gnawing on the executioner's body. She was stunned for a moment. The next moment, her eyes swept around again. Looking at the dead corpses all over the place, her pupils slightly shrank. Is it whoosh, whoosh, whoosh? At this moment, 3 huge dragon wings similar to Aisha's came at an extremely fast speed, but their dragon wings were covered with a layer of dark red blood film. They were pure flesh wings, while the back of Aisha's dragon wings were covered with blood-red feathers. Sister, the leading figure, made a surprised voice. Hearing this voice, Aisha's contracted pupils suddenly recovered slowly. She put away the shock on her face. She didn't look back, but silently looked at the executioner's body on the ground, showing a thoughtful look. Hathaway took the lead and stopped beside Aisha. She glanced forward and immediately took the purgatory scene below into her eyes. When she saw the giant monster skeleton, she suddenly stared slightly and was shocked. Your Highness Aisha has seen you. Your Highness Aisha has seen you. The 2 people behind Hathaway hurried and immediately saluted Aisha. Then they looked at the place where the 2 people were looking at and suddenly showed a shocked look. Isn't this the executioner? One of them was shocked and said, How could it die here? What happened here? The shock on Hathaway's face had calmed down, and her brows were wrinkled. Both her appearance and the current demeanor were somewhat similar to Aisha's. She showed a thoughtful look and said, "There are so many walking dead bodies around, and there are even high-level walking dead like the giant walking dead. Could it be there's a corpse king here?" Corpse king? The white-skinned young man who spoke before glared and said, "Is it difficult? Is it possible that this executioner was eaten by the corpse king?" Another middle-aged man with a protruding bone spur on his arm looked ugly and said, "If it's the corpse king, it's a big trouble. If it's not the corpse king, it's another monster." Hathaway's eyes flickered slightly and whispered, "Other monsters hurt the executioner, and then it met this small group of corpses and was killed." Whiz. When the three people communicated, Aisha's figure suddenly descended and landed a few meters above the executioner's body. Several walking dead who were gnawing on the corpse saw Aisha and immediately looked up and roared, reaching for her boots. She held the giant's sword on her back, and the bandage was automatically untied. Suddenly, the blood flashed, and the bodies of several walking dead suddenly froze. The next moment, the head slowly slipped from the bridge of the nose, and the cut surface was neat. Hathaway and the other two also followed at this moment. Its parasitic soul worm seems to be gone. The previous middle-aged man looked at the corpse and saw that its internal organs had been completely gnawed, and there would be no parasitic soul worm left. Hearing his words, Hathaway bit her teeth slightly and clenched her fingers, but soon loosened and said to Aisha, "Sister, it seems that in the wasteland of our dragon clan, there is a terrible monster. We have to find it out as soon as possible. Otherwise, other pioneers who are performing tasks outside will fall into the hands of monsters at any time." Aisha didn't hear her words, looked at the corpse for a moment, and slowly said, "It was killed by the corpse king. This should be a formed corpse king, carrying the corpse tied. Luca, you go back immediately and pass down the order. There's a corpse king. Once you see the corpse tied, retreat immediately." Chapter 584. This is a relic? Hearing Eureka's words, the blonde woman and the other two were stunned. Dean was slightly startled. He couldn't help but look at the door carefully, and soon noticed a raised stone beside the door. "Be careful," Eureka said with a dignified expression. "There are many kinds of relics. Some have treasures left from the old era, and some are traps with destructive light that can penetrate everything." Destructive light? Dean's heart moved. Was it a laser? He immediately stopped the idea of going forward to explore. If there were really laser weapons in the relics, according to Eureka, it seemed that the energy of the laser weapons was not exhausted, indicating that there was also a solar energy system installed in the relics. However, if Eureka had seen laser weapons, did it mean that the people inside the giant wall also mastered laser weapons? Destructive light? Is it a weapon? Dean asked Eureka on purpose. The blonde woman and the other two also looked at Eureka curiously. "Almost, it should be a kind of weapon from the old era," Eureka said in a deep voice. "Even the pioneers can't avoid it. It's very dangerous." "No way. The people of the old era are so strong. Weren't they exterminated? If there's such a strong power, how could they be exterminated?" The blonde woman and the other two were surprised. Dean's eyes narrowed slightly, and he asked Eureka, "Since this weapon is so strong, why didn't you bring it back to the giant wall? Why haven't I heard of it?" Eureka shook his head slightly. "It's useless to dismantle it. After all, it's an old weapon. We don't know how to use it." "I see." Dean was a little relieved. If the people inside the giant wall mastered the laser weapons of the old era, it would be really tricky. Even his new magic couldn't resist it. However, judging from the current situation, the people inside the giant wall should not have such power as laser weapons. Otherwise, it would be enough to deter all the pioneers and command all the pioneers. Obviously, the forces in the inner wall were complicated and not twisted into a rope, which meant that the forces in the inner wall were not loyal to the same person. Step back a little. Eureka stared at the giant stone door for a moment, and suddenly his eyes moved and he said in a deep voice. Dean and others immediately retreated. Eureka pulled out a dark spear from his back. The body of the spear was engraved with many inscriptions, which looked extremely simple. At this moment, these inscriptions seemed to be the color of burning blood. The body of the spear gradually changed, especially from the hilt that Eureka held in his hand. It gradually dissolved. The spear shaft that had dissolved into a viscous liquid spread along his palm and wrapped around his body like a living liquid. Dean's pupils shrank. Was this a magic weapon? Was this really just a genetic weapon? A moment later, Eureka's whole body was wrapped in the dark red liquid. Sharp thorns and scales protruded from all parts of his body. Behind the armor, the mucus converged and extended to form a tail more than 3 meters long. His body also changed accordingly, and there was a faint cracking sound of bones protruding from his body. His figure also became much taller. The change ended quickly. In the blink of an eye, the handsome Eureka with a scholarly temperament was gone. Instead, a monster with black skin, scales, a black tail, and a head like a lion appeared in front of Dean and others. Dean felt a strong sense of oppression, and there was a shivering feeling of shrinking pores. Intuition told him that the person in front of him was not Eureka, but a real monster. "Step back a little more," the monster said to Dean and others in a hoarse voice. Hearing his voice, Dean's eyes flashed, and he stepped back 7 or 8 meters. After Dean and the others were far away, Eureka took a step forward. A spike protruded from his black arm, which was as thick as an orangutan's. It was half a meter long, and the tip looked like a spear. His figure suddenly flashed, and he slammed into the giant door on the stone wall. The spear-like black spike suddenly stabbed into the gap of the door. Bang! There was a huge shock. The lime sand on the rock wall above everyone's head fell, and a large amount of dust fluttered on the giant stone door. Eureka looked at the front of the black spike, but it did not pierce into the gap of the door. His heart was moved, and he stepped back a few steps. He waved the black spike on the giant stone door, and soon a dent was made, and stone chips were flying. After a moment, the dust dispersed. Dean and others suddenly saw that under the black spike on Eureka's arm, lines appeared on the giant stone door. The lines revealed a dark gold color, which seemed to be some kind of metal. Dean was startled and suddenly realized that this was not a stone door, but a metal door. It was just that the accumulation of dust over the years formed a stone shell on the door. If it's a modern metal gate from the old era, then Dean's eyes fell on a raised stone next to the gate. He immediately said to Eureka, "General, cut the stone chips there and let's see." Eureka turned his head and glanced at Dean. His dark green eyes flashed slightly. He glanced at the raised stone and jumped over. His arms waved quickly, and the stone chips splashed. Soon, the stone chips on the raised stone were all removed, and the shape inside was revealed. It was a metal instrument. Dean saw this metal instrument, and his eyes suddenly lit up. This should be the password lock to open the door. Eureka stopped and looked at the metal instrument. Dean waited for a moment, and seeing that no mechanism was triggered, he immediately walked over. Seeing this, the blonde woman and the others also followed. Dean reached out to touch the metal instrument. Eureka hurriedly said, "Be careful." Dean glanced at him. Seeing that he did not notice any mechanism, he secretly thought that he was making a fuss. He raised his finger and opened the metal shell on the surface of the metal instrument. Suddenly, he was stunned. There was a screen inside, and there was no password button. Could it be that this was an iris scan? Eureka was startled by Dean's action. He looked around vigilantly. Seeing that no mechanism was triggered, he was a little relieved. When he was about to blame Dean, he saw Dean's finger press a button-like thing in the metal box. Damn it! Eureka was furious. Before he could reprimand Dean, a red light suddenly shot out from the metal box and swept toward them. Not good. Eureka was shocked, but after all, he was a pioneer. He reacted very quickly. He hurriedly raised his hand to cover his face and retreated. At this critical moment, he instinctively retreated to save his life. After retreating 4 or 5 meters, he remembered to protect Dean's life. When he raised his head and was about to grab Dean, he saw that the red light had disappeared. Dean and the other three, who were standing in front of the metal box, could not react in time. They only had time to protect their heads in a hurry. There were no wounds on their bodies. When Dean saw the light from the dialysis machine, he confirmed that it was an iris scan. He couldn't help but be disappointed. If it was an iris scan, then only the person who entered his iris into the machine could open the door. Scan completed. Identity confirmed. Shelter opened. Chapter 585. Open. Dean was stunned. Eureka, who reacted later, heard the mechanical voice and was shocked. He pulled Dean's body back a few steps. He looked at the metal instrument vigilantly and shouted, "Who are you? Come out." Hearing his words, the blonde woman and the other two were shocked and hurriedly stepped back. They pulled out their weapons and looked at the metal instrument nervously. They didn't expect that there was a person hiding inside, but they couldn't see any clues at all. It was terrible. A person. Dean was stunned for a moment and quickly reacted. He felt funny in his heart and relieved at the same time. It seemed that these people didn't understand English and didn't understand the previous words. This was good, so they wouldn't be suspicious of him. Buzz. At this moment, the ground under everyone's feet suddenly shook, and the dust on the surrounding walls rustled down. No, it's an earthquake. Eureka's face changed slightly and hurriedly said, "It's going to collapse soon. Leave." Before he finished speaking, he suddenly stopped and looked at the stone door in front of him, stunned. Rumble. The gap in the middle of the stone door slowly split open. In the trembling sound of the ground, it gradually opened to both sides. Thick dust rolled out from under the stone door and rushed toward everyone, making them dusty. Who? Suddenly, like a sigh of the wind, came out of the stone door. Soon, the stone door disappeared completely and retracted into the walls on both sides. A lot of rubbed stone chips fell from the walls. In the thick fog of dust, the few of them raised their hands to cover their faces. Squinting their eyes, they peered inside, only to see that the stone door was pitch black, without the slightest bit of light. It was as if a dark, bloody mouth was waiting for them to enter. Eureka, the blonde woman, and others were secretly shocked and didn't dare to move. When Dean saw the open giant door, he was completely shocked. It was really open, not to mention the fact that there was still energy here. Just the opening of this door was too strange. Could it be that the previous scan was not an iris scan? However, he was in his father's research institute since he was a child. He was familiar with iris scanning and fingerprint scanning. The previous scan was clearly an iris scan. Thinking of this, he couldn't help but glance at Eureka, the blonde woman, and the others next to him. He saw that they were nervous and vigilant, and their muscles were tense, as if they were ready to fight with the previous person at any time. This expression did not seem to be fake. He recalled the scene of the previous iris scan. Eureka retreated immediately, and the blonde woman and the other two bowed their heads to protect their heads. It seemed that only he was scanned. In other words, it is the first time for them to come here. The door was open because it scanned me? Dean was at a loss. Was it related to him? However, he had never been here before. Even before he went into hibernation, he didn't remember that there would be such a thing buried underground. According to the electronic voice from before, this place seemed to be called the shelter. Could it be a place built by the people of the olden era to avoid disaster? When he was puzzled, the thick fog-like dust gradually settled, revealing the scene inside the stone door. Although it was dark, Dean's dark vision could see without hindrance that there were dozens of human skeletons lying on the ground beside the door. The skeletons seemed to have decayed long ago, wrapped in old human clothes. Surprisingly, these clothes were relatively intact and had not been eroded too seriously by time. And the styles of the clothes were various, including dresses, jeans and shirts, long-sleeve shirts, and so on. Dean was stunned. These clothes were the most common clothes of the olden era. Could it be that the skeletons on the ground were ordinary people of the olden era? Light the fire. Eureka's voice sounded. The middle-aged man in the blonde woman's group took out a torch from his backpack, poured kerosene on it, and lit it. The faint fire suddenly dispelled the darkness in front of them. The skeletons all over the ground were reflected in their sight, and their faces changed slightly. Eureka's eyes flickered slightly. He glanced at the metal instrument beside the stone door and thought that this should be the device to open the ruins. He turned his head and glanced at Dean, frowning slightly. Did this kid accidentally touch it, or did he already know the use of this device? I didn't expect that this is the thing to open the ruins. Brother Eureka, what kind of ruins do you think it is? Are there any treasures in it? Dean saw Eureka's eyes and immediately showed curiosity and asked him. Hearing Dean's words, Eureka's eyes flickered, and the doubts in his heart were suddenly dispelled. He thought that even if this kid had a good relationship with Her Highness Aisha, he might not know about the ruins. After all, this was the product of the olden era more than 300 years ago. Even Her Highness Aisha was not clear about it, let alone him. It's not clear yet. Eureka took back his eyes and looked at the dark ruins. He said to the middle-aged man holding the torch, "You go ahead and lead the way." The middle-aged man's face changed, and he hurriedly said, "General, I'm not good at defense, just do as I say." Eureka scolded, and then his tone slowed down a little, and he said indifferently, "In my opinion, this should be a treasure ruins. If there are traps in the dangerous ruins, we will be attacked when the door is opened." The middle-aged man was slightly startled, and he couldn't help but feel moved. But after all, he was a veteran hunter, so he quickly suppressed his greed and thought, "In your opinion, how can my life be used as a scapegoat for you, just because of your guess?" "General, my perception is relatively weak. If I go ahead and encounter any danger, I'm afraid I won't be able to perceive it in advance. I'm afraid it will harm everyone." The middle-aged man tried to persuade from a different perspective. When Eureka heard his words, how could he not know what he was thinking? He snorted and said, "I said, there is no danger in here. If you talk more, I'll throw you in directly." The middle-aged man's face was ugly. He knew that things couldn't be changed. He secretly gritted his teeth, held the torch high, and slowly stepped into the ruins. Every step he took made him feel like stepping into a death swamp, and he would fall at any time. Crack, crack. His boots broke the corpses on the ground. The corpses that had lost water were extremely fragile and broke with one step. Dean silently followed in the middle of the team, keeping a distance from Eureka. Although Eureka's attitude towards him had always been relatively peaceful, and he had the task of protecting him, when the real danger came, it was hard to guarantee that Eureka would not grab him and use him as a scapegoat. To survive outside the wall, every step had to rely on wisdom. Soon, all of them entered the ruins. The middle-aged man stepped out of the pile of corpses at the door and slowly went deeper into the darkness in front of the torch. Dean glanced around the ruins with his night vision. He found that the inside of the ruins was an extremely spacious, circular hall. Corpses could be seen everywhere on the ground. All of them were wearing the clothes of ordinary people from the old era. In addition to the dozens of skeletons at the entrance, there were even more scattered corpses everywhere in the circular hall. In some corners, there were even hundreds of skeletons piled up like a mountain of corpses. The densely packed skeletons were wrapped in the clothes of the old era, quietly lying there, their empty eye sockets filled with loneliness. Seeing these corpses wearing the clothes of the old era, Dean had an indescribable feeling in his heart, like sadness, but also like loneliness. The memories of the old era hidden in the depths of his mind slowly emerged in front of him. However, perhaps it was too long, so that he suddenly felt that what emerged in his mind was only a somewhat vague, steel jungle city, and the faces of his father, mother, and sister. In addition, he felt that the impression of other things was a little vague. Had it been so long that it had been forgotten? These corpses, are they the people of the old era? How can there be so many? The blonde woman looked at the corpses around her, among which there were some broken hands and half bones scattered on the ground. It was the first time for her to see a group of corpses from the old era, and she had a strong sense of shock. The bodies of these people from the old era seemed to be very fragile. The young man on the other side said, He did not avoid stepping on the ribs on the chest of a skeleton, did not choose other footholds, and did not care about the objects under his feet. Even if they have been dead for 300 years, the bones are too powder. I heard that people like us, some of whom have special abilities, have been dead for hundreds of years, and their bones are still as hard as steel. These corpses are at most rubbed with flour. In any era, there are weak and strong, and these should be the weak. Eureka said indifferently. He turned his head and looked around, frowning. It was too quiet here, so quiet that there was no sound. Could it be that there were no living things in it at all? Dean heard the words of these people and took a look at the corpses piled up around him. He was basically sure that this was just a shelter built before the disaster broke out. This could also be seen from the corpses on the ground. Most of these corpses were women and children. It was not a valuable sealed place to hide old technological weapons. He was a little disappointed in his heart, but not too regretful. After all, if there were really high-tech items from the old era, with Eureka, they would eventually have to be handed over to the Dragon Clan. If it fell into the hands of the inner wall, it would become a hindrance to his future. It seems that there was a fight here. There are a lot of broken limbs and corpses, the blonde woman said. Dean frowned slightly. He had already noticed this, and then associated it with the environment here. Obviously, these people were the lucky ones selected by the army and sent to this shelter. Most of the fights here were because of food. Could it be that the door can't be opened from inside? Dean looked back at both sides of the door, but did not see the iris scanner. He could not help but frown. If the door couldn't be opened from the inside, causing them to have to compete for food here, that is to say, the people who sent these survivors here were probably planning to wait for the disaster to end, and then they would open it from the outside. The only use of this approach was to avoid some people inside from opening the shelter, because of their own reasons and sacrificing everyone. Soon, the middle-aged man went deep into the center of the circular hall with a torch. At this time, Dean passed by a pile of corpses. Because of the angle, he suddenly saw the outline of a door under the gap of the pile of corpses leaning against the wall. From the height, it seemed to be about 3 meters. His gaze focused, and very quickly he quietly turned his gaze to look around, but with the help of his opened-up vision, he used his peripheral vision to carefully look at the pile of corpses. Very quickly, he discovered that it was not an illusion. There was indeed a door hidden under the pile of corpses. His heart was slightly moved, but he did not tell Eureka and others. On the contrary, he planned to wait for the next time to sneak in and check it out. Anyway, with the size of the ruins, Eureka and others could not move it away. Although he did not know what was in the door, since it was the secret he found, of course, he would not easily share it with others. If there was a treasure hidden inside, it would bring him a fatal disaster. There's a black shadow over there. What is it? Dean immediately pointed to another place and said. Hearing Dean's words, Eureka and the others were shocked and a little nervous, especially the middle-aged man who was leading the way holding the torch. He swallowed his saliva and shone the torch at the place where Dean was pointing. He slowly approached it, only to find that it was just a pile of corpses. He breathed a sigh of relief and then became a little annoyed. However, thinking of Dean's unknown identity, he resisted the urge to scold him. This place is very big. For now, there should be no danger. Light it up first, Eureka said. Hearing this, Dean thought it was not good. Once it was illuminated, they were likely to find the door. When the blonde woman heard the words, she immediately turned out their own torches and kerosene, ignited them, and inserted them in the surrounding corpses. Several torches and kerosene lamps were lit in the darkness, and the outline of the circular hall was immediately illuminated. It's going to be discovered. Dean saw that the blonde woman and the other two were still lighting new oil dishes. He knew that the door would be exposed sooner or later. He sighed in his heart. It seemed that it was not his own opportunity. He didn't force it. After all, it was inevitable. Kaka! Suddenly, outside the gate of the ruins behind them, there were several footsteps, and there was the sound of stones being kicked away and rolling. Everyone was shocked and looked back in an instant. This look, Dean's face suddenly changed. He saw 3 huge figures coming from the entrance of the ruins. They were 3 giant walking dead. No, it's the giant walking dead. He hurriedly cried. Eureka heard Dean's words, and his heart moved. This kid's perception was so strong. This idea flashed, and soon he also saw the 3 giant walking dead that were shaking and gradually accelerating. He was shocked. How could there be 3 giant walking dead here? Could it be that it had followed their scent? Damn it! Eureka bit his teeth slightly and said, "You step back." With that, he bent his body slightly and jumped out. Is it the giant walking dead? The blonde woman hurriedly retreated in fear. This was not a monster they could fight. Chapter 586. Whoosh. After inspiring the magic weapon, Eureka's figure was as fast as a phantom, which was different from before. In a blink of an eye, he came to the front of 3 giant walking dead, and all the corpses along the way were trampled into powder. He suddenly waved the spear-like dark weapon on his arm that was integrated with his body and jumped up to stab the head of a male giant walking dead. Suddenly, the vascular tissue of the male giant walking dead was extremely flexible. He twisted his head in a thrilling way to avoid Eureka's attack, but his cheek was scratched with a bloodstain. Eureka missed a blow, and his body instantly rushed up. His tail wrapped around the waist of the male giant walking dead, and his body stepped on its abdomen and quickly climbed to its shoulder like a dexterous monkey. The giant walking dead roared and waved to grab him, but touched nothing. Eureka was like a flexible loach. Roar! The half-meter-long neck on the shoulder of the giant walking dead twisted to bite him. Eureka's dark green eyes narrowed and waited for a moment. At the moment when it was about to bite his body, the spear on his arm suddenly pierced out, penetrated through its mouth, and came out from the back of its head. All of this happened in an instant. It was only 2 or 3 seconds before, and after that, a giant walking dead fell to the ground and died. Seeing this, Dean and the blonde woman were relieved at the same time, and there was some shock in their eyes. After inspiring the magic weapon, Eureka's speed and strength obviously rose more than 1 level. Is this the power of the magic weapon? Dean's eyes flashed with a strange light, and he quietly clenched his hand. After a giant walking dead was solved, the remaining 2 immediately rushed to Eureka at the same time, but their speed was a little slow and clumsy in front of Eureka, and they never touched his body. Occasionally, the sharp claws scratched, but they were blocked by the dark scales on Eureka's body, causing no harm. Dean observed the rare pioneer battle scene. He had to say that Eureka's fighting ability was extremely strong. With a flexible body, in the case of 1 versus 2, he still firmly occupied the upper hand, without any injury on his body. Instead, he caused more and more wounds on the chest and neck of the 2 giant walking dead. Although these wounds did not affect the action of the giant walking dead, it was enough to see that Eureka fought with ease and terrifying strength. This giant walking dead is no different from the ordinary walking dead, but its physique is stronger. It still relies on instinct to fight. It has no rules and skills. It will only attack. Dean observed and noticed that the fighting style of the 2 giant walking dead was very simple, without any fighting skills. However, even so, with their fearless fighting style and physique, if they were to encounter a low-intelligence, brutal, and violent magical creature, they would be able to cause great damage. But if it was a human, it would be too much of a loss. Because he could see their attack methods at a glance, he could predict their attack direction and method in advance, and fight with twice the result with half the effort. This was also the reason why Eureka could quickly kill the first giant walking dead. But if it was a monster, it might not have such insight and cunning. So powerful. Is this the general's true power? Too strong. The blonde woman and the other 2 held the torch high. With the weak fire, they could only see a series of afterimages. It was difficult to see Eureka's movements, but they could see the increasing wounds on the 2 giant walking dead. Half a minute later, the battle ended quickly, and all 3 giant walking dead were killed. Eureka gasped slightly, turned back to Dean, and said, "It's not advisable to stay here for a long time. Leave immediately." Dean glanced at him. Although the battle ended quickly, it could be seen that his consumption was also relatively large. Whether it was an ordinary person or a pioneer, the time to maintain the full state was not much different. Boom! Suddenly, Dean heard a low tremor in his ear, coming from the ground above his head. He was slightly stunned, and suddenly there was an ominous premonition in his heart. Eureka also heard the tremor, and his face changed slightly. He quickly fell to the ground and listened to it. His pupils suddenly shrank, and he hurriedly got up and said quickly, "Leave here immediately. There are things above, a lot of them." The blonde woman's face changed, and she couldn't help but hold the weapon tightly, trying to keep calm. Eureka turned to lead the team and rushed out of the ruins. When he just went out of the gate, he stopped immediately. He saw that there were some swaying figures in the previous passage, and they were walking dead. Some of these walking dead were ordinary walking dead, the size of ordinary humans, but their arms were sickles. Some were bloated like a ball, and some were tall and sturdy. It was the giant walking dead. Different kinds of walking dead gathered here at the moment, swaying toward the crowd. Everyone looked at it, and their faces changed. Eureka's pupils contracted slightly, and such a scene made him think of two words: corpse-tide. Only in the corpse-tide, there will be all kinds of walking dead. Damn it! Eureka bit his teeth slightly and scolded his bad luck in his heart. He didn't expect to choose an area that was often cleaned on the outer edge of the Red Wasteland. He didn't know how many corpses there were. If it was only a small corpse-tide, he could deal with it. If it was a medium-sized corpse-tide, he could only save his life and couldn't take care of Dean. "Get ready to go out with me." Eureka bit his teeth and said in a deep voice, "You guys protect Dean for me. If he has an accident, you don't want to live. Do you know?" The blonde woman and the other two looked ugly. They couldn't help but look at Dean next to them. There was some resentment and annoyance in their hearts. The wasteland was not a place to play. Obviously, they were distinguished, but they had to come to such a place to suffer. Didn't they have nothing to do? Dean noticed the resentment in the eyes of the three people and knew that he had become a burden to them. He didn't say anything, but secretly paid attention to prevent the three people from pushing him out to be a scapegoat when they encountered a fatal danger. After all, the order was the order. Who knew if they would obey it? Kill. After Eureka gave the order, he growled like a black lion, crouched on the ground, and rushed into the zombies. This was the only way to the outside, so he had to kill his way out as soon as possible. Otherwise, it would be difficult for him to get away when the zombies gathered. "Follow us," the blonde woman and the other two said to Dean, and their tone was a little cold. The three formed a triangular lineup, with Dean in the middle, and followed Eureka. Soon, several people collided with the walking dead in the passage, and the battle broke out in an instant. Eureka shot like electricity, waving the dark spear on his arm to kill quickly. In this group battle, he no longer pursued to kill these walking dead, only to repel them. Therefore, the place of attack was no longer seeking their heads, but the joints such as limbs. As a result, the battle became more and more fierce, like a humanoid tank crashing into a pile of corpses. 7 or 8 strange-shaped corpses were immediately picked up. The triangular lineup formed by the blonde woman and the other two protected Dean and followed Eureka, blocking the corpses that were shot back again. After all, the three were dragon guards. In addition to the high-level corpses, such as the giant walking dead, other ordinary corpses and sickle corpses were easily killed in their hands like cutting melons and vegetables. Some heads fell, and some were kicked back into the corpse-tide. After rushing into the corpse-tide for more than 10 meters, a giant walking dead that was repelled by Eureka climbed up from the ground and rushed toward Dean and others behind him. The blonde woman and the other two were pale with fright and hurriedly shouted, "General!" When Eureka heard the sound, he looked back and roared fiercely. He jumped up and threw himself on the giant walking dead. The tail quickly wrapped around the blood vessel tissue on its neck. The scales on the tail suddenly stood up like a sharp blade. As the tail tightened, the blade continued to cut into its neck. The blood flowed out and froze the scales on its tail into white frost crystals. His body was also caught by the giant walking dead, and he had to fight back. At this time, the rest of the walking dead rushed toward Dean and others. In addition to the sickle corpses, there was a carrion walking dead with a bloated body. The hunting level was 42, and it was extremely powerful. It knocked the middle-aged man on the left side of the lineup and leaned toward Dean in the encirclement. Dudian immediately stretched out his hand to hold his back. His elbow slightly shook to offset the impact of the impact. After the middle-aged man's body stabilized, he immediately waved his knife and pierced into the body of the carrion walking dead. The blade easily penetrated its body. However, when the middle-aged man wanted to pull out the knife, he couldn't pull it out. At this moment, in the bloated abdomen of the carrion walking dead, a huge mouth full of strange teeth suddenly opened and bit toward the middle-aged man. "Be careful!" The young man next to him hurriedly pulled out his sword and stabbed it to the abdomen. Whoosh! At the same time as he pulled out his sword, a black figure suddenly jumped out of the corpse group and rushed toward the back of the young man from the other side. Suddenly, the young man who could not react fell to the ground, pressed on him, and bit his face desperately. Dean and the blonde woman looked at it, and their faces suddenly changed. They saw that it was a lizard-like walking dead with scales all over its body, and its feet had degenerated into a tail. It was one of the high-level walking dead, the strange walking dead, a hunting level of 46. No. The young man pushed with all his might, but his face was torn into a bloody mess by a few short claws sticking out from under its throat. Puff! A black shadow suddenly flashed, wrapped around the neck of the strange walking dead on the young man's body, pulled its body up, and fell heavily to the ground. It was Eureka who broke away from the giant walking dead. "Keep up!" Eureka screamed and rushed forward. The blonde woman hurriedly put her hand to pull the young man up from the ground. Suddenly, she felt that her foot was held by a hand. Looking down, it was an ordinary walking dead that had been cut into 2 pieces by herself. She was annoyed and lifted her foot to step on its head. Puff! The head burst open, revealing the hardened brain tissue inside. She kicked the walking dead away. Puff! The walking dead's shoulder was broken, and the body flew into the corpse group, but the arm was still clasped on her ankle. At this moment, she had no time to squat down and pull the walking dead's hand down. She could only ignore it and rush behind Eureka. Soon, under the leadership of Eureka, several people killed a way out of the corpse group, climbed along the steep slope, and climbed to the outside. Roar! Roar! As soon as they came to the ground, before they had time to see the surroundings, they heard a deafening roar. Hearing the hoarse roar, Dean couldn't help but feel a tremor in his heart. He looked up, and his face suddenly changed, full of strong shock. He saw the walking dead wandering around the gravel, and the number was very large. In the open space, hundreds of meters away in front, thousands of walking dead were wandering here. Some of the walking dead were even larger than the giant walking dead, but the body was not like a human, but like a giant elephant, extremely bloated. The tremor that several people heard in the ground was the sound caused by the walking dead. "This is the corpse tide." Dean felt a little shocked. It was the first time he saw so many walking dead, and their postures were strange. There were many strange walking dead. The so-called strange walking dead was not the name of certain walking dead, but a general term referring to the walking dead whose body was transformed. "Run!" Eureka growled and rushed to a place where there were fewer zombies. He was like a mad lion, opening the way in front of him, knocking away all the zombies that came to him. Dean and the blonde woman and others immediately followed and rushed at full speed. The ordinary corpses behind them could not keep up with the speed of several people, and were suddenly thrown far away. However, in the wandering corpses around, there was a very fast and incomparable corpses with strange postures. Some are like spiders, with 3 or 4 arms under the armpits, crawling to chase. Some are like the lizard-like corpses that had been killed before, crawling on the ground at a very fast speed. And there were thin wings on the back, flying to chase at low altitude. Dean saw that one of the undeads was wearing a broken armor. The armor was covered with dust and blood, but he could vaguely see a fragment of a dragon pattern. It turned out to be a dragon warrior who had been infected into an undead's. At this moment, the walking dead with the broken armor was chasing after them at a very fast speed. In a blink of an eye, it was close to Dean and others. Damn it! The blonde woman screamed angrily. Eureka turned his head and saw that there were 7 or 8 walking dead behind him. He was shocked. While waving his arms to hit 2 walking dead, he glanced around and suddenly saw a large number of walking dead scattered nearby, wandering aimlessly, and the number was extremely large. How can there be so many high-level walking dead? Is it a medium-sized corpse tide? Eureka looked ugly, clenched his teeth, and increased his speed by 30% again. At this time, the injured young man fell behind the team and was immediately overtaken by the walking dead with the broken armor. He fell to the ground and had no resistance. The rest of the chasing walking dead smelled the blood and immediately rushed over. A dash, the young man screamed in pain, full of extreme panic. "General," the blonde woman hurriedly shouted. Eureka had noticed the things behind and said in a deep voice, "I can't save him. Keep up. I have to speed up again." Chapter 587. Run! Seeing that the young man was dead, Dean's face changed slightly, and he immediately shouted to the blonde woman and the middle-aged man. At the same time, he suddenly sped up, past the two in an instant, and followed Eureka closely. His figure was as flexible as a fish, avoiding the attack of a fish that escaped the net. Although it was a low-rank sickle zombie that rushed at him and he could kill it with one punch, it would affect his speed. In such a tide of corpses, once he was entangled, even a pioneer could not escape death. The blonde woman and the middle-aged man looked at the scene of the young man being eaten by several walking dead, and their faces were ugly. Although they did not have a deep friendship with the young man, after all, they were comrades in arms, and it was inevitable that they had some grief and indignation. At this moment, hearing Dean shout, the two immediately came back to their senses. Seeing that the number of walking dead rushing from all directions was increasing, the grief and indignation in their hearts were suddenly replaced by fear. Run! The two did not dare to stay, and quickly turned and ran. While running at full speed, they could not help but secretly pray, hoping that a few fast high-level walking dead behind could eat the young man's body for a while, so that they could catch up a little later. Roar! Roar! The surrounding walking dead gradually gathered towards them, and the roar was like a tide, making people tremble. Eureka was extremely fast in front of them, rushing like a raging beast, knocking all the walking dead in front of him. His tail, arms, head, and whole body seemed to be turned into weapons like a galloping black tank. The blonde woman and the middle-aged man galloped with all their strength, only to feel that their legs were running fast and not listening to their own brain. But even so, the two watched Eureka in front of them getting farther and farther away. At the same time, the two suddenly found that Dean, who needed their protection before, burst out at a speed that was far beyond them, always following behind Eureka like a shadow. There was a trace of shock in the eyes of the two. Was this young man so strong? Roar! A low roar came from behind, and the tremor of the ground behind them was getting closer and closer. The blonde woman and the middle-aged man felt a chill in their hearts. They immediately knew that there were several walking corpses behind them that were extremely fast. This made their hair stand up, and they were frightened. There was no doubt that once they were entangled by these walking corpses, Eureka, who was rushing forward crazily at this moment, would not turn back to save them. After all, they were not as lucky as Dean, and they did not have a formidable background. Both of them were filled with fear and even despair. "Run, my legs!" The middle-aged man cried out in grief and indignation. Fear crawled onto his face. As death approached, his speed increased again. His strong desire to live made him burst forth with a speed that he had never reached before. But even so, he suddenly saw that the golden-haired woman beside him actually burst out with a speed that was faster than him, and actually slowly surpassed him by 1 or 2 steps. Wasn't speed not her forte? The middle-aged man's mind buzzed and went blank. Suddenly, he heard a roar coming from behind him. In the blink of an eye, it appeared not far from the back of his head. It seemed The walking corpse was following closely behind him. His face was full of fear, and he turned his head with difficulty. At the same time as he turned his head, a blood-red giant mouth suddenly bit his face. Flop! Dean heard the sound of wrestling coming from behind, and the excited roar of the walking corpse. He could not help but change his face slightly. He did not look back, which would affect his speed, but he slightly tilted his head so that his wide field of vision could see the situation behind him. Suddenly, he saw that the middle-aged man had been thrown to the ground by several strange walking corpses. He was struggling desperately, pushing a few walking corpses, but after all, he only had 2 hands, and there were 4 or 5 walking corpses on him. At this moment, there were more walking corpses gathered over, and soon he was drowned. A scream that just opened and stopped abruptly came from the back of the walking corpse pile. At the same time, the walking corpses that crawled outside the walking corpse pile and could not get in immediately loosened, changed their target, and continued to chase them. Dean's face was ugly. In a moment of life and death, he suddenly felt that nothing was important. It was the best to be able to live. "Dean, give me a hand." At this time, the blonde woman behind begged Dean while chasing at full speed. Her blonde hair was messy and covered her face, which was pitiful. Dean glanced at her with the corner of his eyes and hesitated. At this moment, he was more than 10 meters away from her. If he wanted to pull her, he had to slow down by 10 meters. Although it only took a pause of less than 0.1 seconds, once the speed was reduced, it was not as simple as 0.1 seconds to sprint for another 10 meters. "Sorry." He bowed his head slightly and said, and then ran at full speed, following Eureka. Hearing Dean's words, the blonde woman's face changed, and her pleading eyes flashed a touch of resentment. At this moment, there was a burst of roar behind her, and the speed was strange, getting closer and closer to her. Her pupils shrank, and she instinctively had an impulse to look back, but this would undoubtedly affect her speed. She clenched her teeth and pleaded loudly to Dean without looking back. "Please, we have been protecting you all the way. Can't you pull me? I beg you, just give me a hand. I'll make love to you when we get back. I'll use my body to repay you. You could do whatever you want, please." Dean gritted his teeth slightly and continued to run. Seeing that Dean's speed did not slow down at all, the blonde woman was completely desperate. At the same time, a bloody claw slammed on her shoulder. In an instant, her mind was blank. Then, 4 or 5 sharp claws stretched out from behind her and grabbed her shoulders, some pressed her head, and some hugged her waist. With a plop, her body, which was running at full speed, was suddenly pulled. The next moment, she was dragged into the zombies behind her. Her ears were full of roars, and the sky disappeared in an instant, covered by ugly and hideous faces. Hearing the screams behind him, Dean's face changed slightly. He knew it was the blonde woman without looking. He clenched his teeth slightly and did not look back. He exhausted his endurance to maintain the full speed at the moment and followed behind Eureka. "Get out, get out, get out!" Eureka roared and rushed forward, quickly knocking away the zombies that rushed toward him, and abruptly opened a bloody road that stretched for several miles. However, even though he had rushed thousands of meters away from the zombie horde, he still did not feel happy in his heart, because within his sight, there was still a large number of scattered zombies. Wasn't the scale of the zombie horde too big this time? However, fortunately, he felt that Dean was still following him. As for the other 3 people who died one after another, although they slightly stimulated his nerves, they did not let him care. For many years in the wasteland, he had been accustomed to the death of his comrades and companions. It was not a habit, but a numbness. As long as Dean could live, then he wouldn't be punished by Aisha. Judging from the previous secret explanation, he knew that Aisha was not joking this time. "If you want to live, keep up with me." Eureka roared and knocked away a giant walking dead in front of him, rushing quickly. Dean saw the giant walking dead again, and his whole body was covered with goosebumps. He hurriedly stimulated the whole body strength and entered the primary limitless mode. A large number of white bones exuded under the skin, covering the whole body. At the same time, his speed broke out again and instantly rushed out like a cannonball, biting the position of less than 5 meters behind Eureka. This distance was the limit. If he was pulled away again, he was very likely to lose Eureka. At that time, he could only open the way by himself or stimulate his wings. But if he used the wings to fly, it was no longer a matter of exposure. But even if he used the wings to fly, he might not be able to rush out of the zombies alive. The two flew at full speed along a straight line. The zombies wandering around quickly gathered towards the two. The strange walking dead that ate the blonde woman in the rear also chased again, but their speed was a little slower than Dean's, and they could barely follow the rear of hundreds of meters away. Eureka looked at the front while rushing, and suddenly found that the number of walking dead was less than a kilometer away. His eyes were bright, and he finally rushed to the edge of the corpse tide. Fortunately, this corpse tide is not fully formed. If it is to maintain the scale of the corpse tide, it will be really dangerous this time. Eureka secretly breathed a sigh of relief, thinking like this. Whoosh! Suddenly, a sound of breaking through the air came at a high speed. The sound was like a bee, screaming and harsh. Eureka was stunned suddenly, only to feel the hairs on his body stand up instantly, and could not help but turn his head. Puff! A black spear fell from the sky, like a black lightning, pierced from his shoulder at the moment when he turned his head, and the strong impact drove his body, instantly nailed to the ground a few meters away in front of him, splashing a big pit. Dean, who was behind Eureka, was shocked. He did not react at all. When he heard the sound, he saw that Eureka in front of him had been taken out by a black object. Spear! When Eureka was nailed, Dean suddenly saw that his shoulder was pierced by a black spear more than 2 meters long, and his body was nailed to the black soil. Eureka coughed up a mouthful of blood, and there was some shock and a trace of fear in his eyes. He turned his head and suddenly saw the dark sky behind him. A dark figure was flying, and there was a pair of huge wings on its back. However, the wings were broken, like the fallen angel depicted in the monastery Bible. Is the Bible true? Such a strange idea emerged in his mind, but it was only a flash, and it was destroyed by reason and pain. His pupils narrowed slightly, and his high-power vision magnified at this moment, and he instantly saw the face of the black figure flying over. At the moment of seeing clearly, his face was full of shock, and he said, "Corpse King?" When Dean saw the black spear on Eureka, he had already looked back and soon noticed the black figure flying in the distance. His thermal vision did not see the slightest heat source on the ladder. He was shocked in his heart. Is it a strong-winged clan? Soon, he heard Eureka's shocked cry, and his heart suddenly trembled. Corpse King? There's a Corpse King here? He learned some information about the Corpse King from Ian and others. In the past 2 days in the fortress, he also read about the Corpse Tide and the Corpse King from books. Legend has it that the Corpse King is the final form of the Walking Dead. It is relatively easy to meet in the Corpse Tide, but it is not absolute. Not all the Corpse Tides will be mixed with the Corpse King, but the Corpse King must come from the Corpse Tide. Moreover, the Corpse King's hunting level is the same as the monsters. It is not fixed. The Corpse King has strong and weak ones. The strong ones can easily kill the pioneers, and the weak ones are comparable to the pioneers. Dean did not expect to meet a Corpse King here. You know, Eureka is only a pioneer, and the Corpse King can also call the Walking Dead, and even control the Walking Dead. He is not Eureka's opponent at all. Puff! Eureka, who was nailed to the ground by the black spear, suddenly jumped with his hands on the ground, and immediately pulled his body out along the end of the spear. He turned around and continued to run forward. Dean was startled and hurried to follow him. However, this time Eureka ran faster than before. With Dean's full burst of speed, he could not catch up and was thrown more than 10 meters away in an instant. Dean's face changed. He suddenly realized that Eureka should be aware of the danger of life, so he broke out with extraordinary speed. In other words, at this time, Eureka would no longer care about him. He clenched his teeth and immediately stimulated the wings on his back. As the wings unfolded, he immediately flapped his wings to push his body and followed Eureka He did not dare to fly high in the sky. The Corpse King behind him had wings. If he also flew high in the sky, it would inevitably attract its attention. At that time, he would use his life to buy time for Eureka to escape. While running at full speed, Dean always paid attention to the back of the Corpse King, in case the Corpse King used a long-range attack again. If he was hit by the spear, he might be killed on the spot. Whoosh! Dean was praying, and a sound of breaking air came again. Dean suddenly saw a black shadow flying toward him. His pupils shrank, and his body hurriedly dodged, but his body seemed to become sluggish. Puff! A black bead brushed past his shoulder and shot into the ground. Dean was so scared that he was in a cold sweat and rushed at full speed. Bang! Suddenly, the ground under Dean's feet rumbled. His pupils shrank, and he hurriedly looked at the front where the vibration was the strongest and suddenly saw a terrible scene. He saw the ground under Eureka, who was running at full speed in front of him, burst open, and a giant hand stretched out from it. The width of the palm was nearly 2 meters. It caught Eureka, who was running at full speed, and held him in the palm. At the same time, in the ground under the palm, the soil cracked open rapidly, and an extremely huge figure sat up from it, covering the sky and the light in an instant. Dean was dumbfounded. This is a supergiant walking dead. In addition to the terrible size gap, the body structure was similar to that of the giant walking dead that Dean had seen before, but the chest and back protruded with several skin-colored spikes, which looked a bit ferocious. Chapter 588. When Dean was stunned, Eureka's scream suddenly sounded. He saw his body was tightly held by the palm of the super giant walking dead, and his arms and legs were all tightly bound. Only a dark tail was swinging at the lower edge of the palm. The sharp part of the tail end hooked to the back of the palm and deeply penetrated into it. But the super giant walking dead obviously had no pain, and the palm was just tighter and tighter. Gotcha! The sound of broken bones sounded, and Eureka couldn't help but scream loudly. The tail that pierced into the giant palm was so painful that it softened and shook in the air like a cramp. Soon, the sound of broken bones became more and more intensive. Eureka struggled fiercely, but he couldn't make any effort. After a while, Dean saw that while he screamed, a lot of blood suddenly gushed out of his mouth, and a lot of blood overflowed from his ears, eyes, and nostrils. Soon, the scream stopped abruptly. With a bang, the huge palm suddenly clenched, and thick blood gushed out from its clenched palm, splashing all over the hand. In the next moment, the super giant walking dead loosened its hand, and the sticky, broken body organs slipped from its palm one by one. It raised it to the mouth and stretched out a giant tongue with dense eyes and sharp teeth to lick it. Then it slowly moved its eyes and looked at another small figure in front of it. Dean's throat rolled, and his mind was a little blank. All this was slow, but in fact, it was only 2 or 3 seconds. Eureka was dead. As a pioneer and one of the 8 generals who guarded the wasteland, he died so easily. The fear that he had never had gripped his heart tightly, and he even forgot to breathe. At this moment, he suddenly thought that if God let him return to the giant wall, he would rather live there forever in this life and never step out again. When death stood in front of him and he was powerless to resist, he realized that life was so insignificant and self-respect was so worthless. The so-called meaning of living was just a stupid and childish idea of having nothing better to do. Just being able to live on was already a wonderful thing. Whoosh! A whistling sound flew over and stopped above Dean's head. Dean's whole body was covered with goosebumps, and the blood in his body seemed to be frozen. He dared not have the slightest movement. He slowly moved his eyes and suddenly saw the Corpse King with 2 broken wings on the back behind him. It was above his head. He was looking down at her from high above. Fear and despair. When these 2 situations appeared at the same time, what would be left in the brain? Was it blank? Who? The Corpse King's figure slowly descended, a gentle breeze brought about by the flapping of its wings. But the breeze was mixed with the stench of rotting corpses. The next moment, Dean heard the ground behind his body tremble slightly. At the same time, the cold breath with the smell of blood and corpses blew from the back of his neck. It seemed that the king of corpses was standing behind him, watching him. Dean's heartbeat suddenly stopped. Time seemed to suddenly slow down, and the air was so quiet that not a single sound could be heard. He would definitely die. These 4 words appeared in his mind. There was no doubt that this kind of self-judgment would cause one to feel despair, but at the same time, there seemed to be a kind of courage in his heart. Since he was going to die, what was there to be afraid of? He clenched his fist, turned around abruptly, and punched behind him. Bang! His fist smashed into a hard object, but it wasn't an absolutely hard object like metal. Instead, it was a kind of toughness that was 10,000 times stronger than rubber. His fist was hitting the chest of the Corpse King behind him. At this moment, a man and a corpse were facing each other. At this moment, Dean also saw the face of the King of Corpses. Its pupils were pure black, without a trace of white. There were several scars on its face. It seemed that it was left not long ago. There was no trace of anger or emotion on its face. Bang! Suddenly, Dean could only see a vague black afterimage, which seemed to be the fist of the Corpse King. The next moment, the pain hit his entire chest, and the signal conveyed by the pain, nerves occupied all his consciousness. His body flew straight back, as if flying into space. His body could not feel gravity at all, until there was a sharp pain in his back again, and he hit something. He coughed up a mouthful of blood and felt a burning sensation in his chest, as if he was suffocating. He forced himself to look up and immediately discovered that the scenery around him was slowly sinking. To be precise, it was his body that was automatically rising. He suddenly looked back and suddenly found himself in the palm of the super giant Walking Dead. At this moment, the Walking Dead was holding himself and sending him into its open, bloody mouth. In the dark giant mouth, there were sharp teeth, and one of the sharp teeth was also clamped with a piece of dark thing, which was a broken thigh of Eureka. No, Dean's pupils dilated. Whoosh! Suddenly, a whistle-like sharp whistling sound flew over and streaked across the distant horizon. When Dean heard the whistling, a strong wind suddenly came from behind, flattening his hair on the back of his head, and his broken armor was fluttering. At the same time, a blood-red light flashed over the top of his head, like a red lightning into the bloody mouth of the super giant Walking Dead. With a bang, Dean felt the giant palm that held him. The next moment, the ground behind the super giant Walking Dead made a huge roar. Dean couldn't help but look at it, and suddenly stood on the spot. He saw a glimmer of light in the dark giant mouth of the super giant Walking Dead, and the depth of the giant mouth was penetrated. Whoosh! Whoosh! At the same time, several flying sounds came at a high speed. Dean only felt that his whole body was light, and a soft palm grabbed his arm and took it to the sky. He couldn't help but turn his head and suddenly saw a familiar face, Aisha. "Are you okay?" Aisha looked at him, and there was a deep meaning in her eyes. Dean's stiff thinking slowly recovered. After a moment, he suddenly thought of the Corpse King behind, and immediately said, "Be careful. The Corpse King is still there." "It's okay," Aisha whispered, and her body fell rapidly and landed on the ground. At the same time, the rumbling sound behind her sounded. Dean looked back and suddenly saw the previous super giant Walking Dead fall down and hit the ground, raising a lot of dust. When the dust came, Dean felt that Aisha released him and immediately stood firm. At the same time, he used the dragon blood technique she taught him to control the heart, change the direction of blood flow, stop the blood in the chest, and then use a small amount of blood to gently soothe the past, slowly heal. "You rest here. I will solve it soon." Aisha's voice came from the side of the dust. As her words fell, a gust of wind rolled up and blew the dust away. She was holding a blood-red giant sword, dragging it from the ground and walking toward the Corpse King step by step. Whoosh! Whoosh! At the same time, several figures in the sky came and landed on the side of Aisha. Dean was stunned. Is Hathaway also here? Hathaway hadn't noticed Dean for a long time. When she saw Dean looking at her, a sly color flashed in her eyes. She naughtily spit her tongue at Dean. This clever behavior was the same as when she was dating Dean when she played Aisha. Dean was startled and slightly wrinkled his eyebrows. I didn't expect you to be here too. You didn't die when you met the Corpse King and the giant god corpse. Gee, you are really lucky, Hathaway said to Dean with a smile. Dean's face sank slightly, and he was silent. After all, you're still too tender. You were so scared that you couldn't walk before. You actually watched the giant god corpse eat you. You were really cowardly. Hathaway showed her white teeth and said with a smile, in the knight's poem, the hero saves the beauty. When it comes to us, it becomes the beauty saves the bear. Sister, it seems that you are better than me in everything, but your eyes are much worse than mine. Shut up. Aisha turned her head and looked at her coldly. Hathaway shrugged slightly. That's the truth. Before she finished her words, she suddenly stopped. A wisp of cold air was on her neck. It was the tip of the blood-red giant sword in Aisha's hand. A middle-aged man next to her saw the stiff atmosphere and quickly said, Your Highness Aisha, Your Highness Hathaway, is just a joke. Don't mind it. Let's solve this Corpse King first. Aisha snorted coldly and took back the giant sword. She looked up and stared at the Corpse King walking slowly in front of her. Her eyes flickered slightly. The smile on Hathaway's face had long disappeared. She was expressionless. She turned her head silently and looked at the Corpse King. Then she said, The executioner was killed by it. There is still the smell of the executioner on its body. Her voice was clear, and there was no childish appearance of the previous smile. Dean was shocked. The executioner was killed, and it was by the Corpse King in front of him? Reynolds, you stay and take care of him, Aisha said to the middle-aged man. The middle-aged man was slightly startled. He was a pioneer, but he stayed to protect this young man. However, thinking that the two sisters actually quarreled and even pulled out their swords for this young man, he couldn't help but look at Dean. His appearance could only be regarded as delicate, not a rare handsome appearance. The heat source in his body was also ordinary. He was just at the limited level. There was nothing outstanding about him. He frowned and said to Aisha, Your Highness, this Corpse King can kill the executioner. It should be a relatively strong Corpse King. If I don't help, no need for you. Aisha interrupted him. You take care of him. This Corpse King is stronger than you think. It's not something that ordinary pioneers can intervene in. Hathaway, come and help me. End the battle as soon as possible so that the corpse tide doesn't gather. Hathaway pretended to be surprised and said, Sister, I'm just an ordinary pioneer. Aren't you afraid that I'll be in danger? Aisha glanced at her and said, You'd better stimulate the magic weapon. Otherwise, you'll die if your blood is awakened. Hathaway pouted slightly, showing a reluctant expression, but there was a hint of seriousness in her eyes. She pulled out the giant spear on her back and clenched her fingers tightly. The body of the spear slowly melted, and like wax, it crawled along her arm and covered her entire body. In an instant, she turned into a 3-meter-tall demonic dragon with a pair of dark red wings and a huge dragon tail. But compared with the real demonic dragon, it was a bit like a human, such as the upright posture, the arms similar to human arms, and the upright chest. Aisha stared at the Corpse King. Seeing that it didn't immediately launch an attack, she suddenly thought of something. She turned her head and looked around. Suddenly, she saw the surrounding corpses slowly gathering. Her face sank. Obviously, when they were talking, the Corpse King didn't take the opportunity to launch an attack. It wasn't gentlemanly etiquette, but it sensed that the enemy was unusual and took the opportunity to summon the corpse tide. Attack! Aisha made a prompt decision. She shouted and suddenly rushed straight up, rolling up a cloud of dust on the ground along the way. Hathaway followed her without saying anything. After using the magic weapon to enter the full combat state, her explosive speed was comparable to Aisha's. Almost at the same time, she rushed to the front of the Corpse King. The two seemed to have a tacit understanding. They suddenly separated and then attacked the Corpse King from the left and right. Let's retreat first, Reynolds, who was ordered to protect Dean, immediately retreated with Dean. Even without Aisha's words, he knew that his participation in this battle would have little effect, and the possibility of sacrifice was extremely high. He knew this when he saw the giant god's corpse. The general corpse king didn't have the protection of the giant god's corpse. The power of the giant god's corpse alone couldn't be matched by a pioneer. At least 2 or 3 pioneers were needed to kill it. I heard that Eureka is with you. Where is he? Reynolds asked Dean while retreating. Dean looked at the battle in front of him without squinting. His face changed slightly when he heard the words. He whispered, he was eaten by the giant god's corpse. What? Reynolds was shocked. He couldn't help but look up at the giant god's corpse. He suddenly noticed that one of its palms was stained with blood. His face suddenly changed. Roar! Roar! At this time, there was a roar around them. A large number of walking dead gathered from all directions. Many of them were extremely fast, and they rushed toward Dean and Aisha. Reynolds's face sank. He pulled out his sword and cut off the necks of several walking dead that rushed over. After repelling a few walking dead, Reynolds saw Dean's pale face, and then looked at his chest, which had completely collapsed. Presumably, many of his ribs were broken. He immediately took out a small bottle from his waist bag and said, "Take one of the healing pills inside." Dean listened to him, took a look, took out a pill, and swallowed it. As the pill entered his mouth, he suddenly felt that the burning pain in his chest was reduced a lot. At the same time, the exhausted power in his body was gradually recovering. He was surprised. He didn't expect the effect of the pill to be so fast. It was worthy of the healing medicine carried by the pioneers. He sighed in his heart. He quickly controlled his heart and accelerated the recovery of the chest injury with the effect of the pill. At the same time, he divided part of his attention to the battlefield in front of him. Boom! 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 Aisha and Hathaway were fighting with the Corpse King. The speed of the three was extremely fast, like a stream of light. Every time they landed, the ground trembled violently, as if hit by a boulder weighing thousands of pounds. Chapter 589. So strong. Reynolds also noticed the battle in front. When he saw that the cooperation of Aisha and Hathaway did not gain the upper hand, he couldn't help but feel shocked. This Corpse King was completely not an existence that ordinary pioneers could deal with. If combined with the Corpse Tide, it could be comparable to those things in the depths of the dark wasteland. Dean saw Reynolds's shocked expression, and his heart sank, saying, "Can they win? Or, you go to help them, I can hold on." Reynolds recovered, waving his sword to cut off the waist of a strange walking dead that rushed to the side, and said to Dean, "This is not a battle I can participate in. They should be fine. Her Highness Aisha hasn't shown her magic weapon yet. She is invincible, and she can definitely win." His tone was very sure. In these years of serving as one of the 8 generals, he had never seen this girl lose. When he first met this girl, he also blamed the people above for sending such a young little girl to guard the wasteland. But after seeing her incredible power that was completely unmatched with her age, he no longer questioned it. In his mind, this girl was the most terrible monster, and there was no monster that she could not defeat. He had never seen her appearance after stimulating the magic weapon, because the usual posture alone was enough to defeat all the monsters he had met. Bang! Suddenly, a dark red streamer fell at high speed and shot into the ground. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and a huge pit was blasted on the ground. Dean's heart jumped, and he looked at it. He saw a figure with dark red scales lying in the huge pit. It was the appearance of Hathaway after stimulating the magic weapon. He suddenly breathed a sigh of relief and looked up at the sky. He saw that the 2 streamers that moved at a high speed stopped. They were the Corpse King and Aisha. At this moment, the 2 confronted each other. This Corpse King was not like ordinary walking dead, which could only bite without order. Instead, it seemed to stop to rest and observe Aisha by the way. Did it have a mind? Dean's mind flashed such a thought. Whoosh! The Corpse King that stopped rushed out again and rushed to Aisha. Aisha's figure flashed as she fought fiercely in the air. Dean was dazzled and anxious. Suddenly, he thought of Hathaway and looked at her. He saw Hathaway sitting up from the giant pit. Her body was moving up and down as she panted. She seemed to be resting on the ground. Damn! Dean clenched his fists in anger. Roar! A hoarse roar suddenly came from the side. Dean was shocked. He turned around and saw a rotten face rushing towards him. He quickly pulled out a dagger and stabbed it. Gotcha! The dagger pierced through the undead's face. Dean lifted his foot and kicked the undead's body. He gasped in pain and reached out to cover his chest. There was a tearing pain. Don't look around. Take care of yourself first. Renault quickly killed several nearby undead. He turned to look at Dean and said, "You can fly. Take off immediately. There are too many undead on the ground." Dean gritted his teeth and endured the pain in his chest. He flapped his wings and flew into the air. Suddenly, he saw the group of undeads gathering from all directions. Farther away, there were still thousands of undeads rushing here at full speed, raising countless dust. It looked extremely spectacular and shocking. Whoosh! An undead with green skin, a flat head, and fist-sized eye sockets suddenly jumped out of the group of undeads and rushed straight to Dean, who was in the air. Dean's face changed slightly. He wanted to flap his wings to change the trajectory, but it was too late. The ladder was too fast. He decisively lifted his leg and aimed at the head of the strange walking dead that jumped over. With a bang, he hit its forehead. At the same time that he couldn't change the trajectory, the strange undead couldn't change the trajectory either. It was kicked upside down. Dean was about to continue to fly. Suddenly, he felt that his foot was wrapped by a soft, warm, and slippery thing. He couldn't help but look down and saw that the strange undead that was kicked down had a very long tongue wrapped around his leg. Damn it! Dean hurriedly bent down and cut it with his dagger. Whoosh! Whoosh! At the same time as he bent down, he saw several figures jumping out of the group of undead. There were several undead with the same strange body. Their jumping power was extremely amazing. One of the undead's hair was completely glued together, like a piece of fleshy wing on the head. It was very ferocious. Dean's face changed. He hurriedly swung his dagger and lifted his leg to kick. Bang! The alloy boots kicked on the chest of an undead. The undead rushed to Dean's feet with its palms, and then desperately gnawed the boots on his feet. The sharp teeth bit along the front toe of the boots. The boots were bitten flat, and the metal pressure made Dean's toes painful. At the same time, several other bouncing undead rushed from other directions of Dean. Some of the bouncing angles were not good. They didn't hit Dean, but hit the undead whose tongue was wrapped around his feet. Then they immediately climbed up the body of the undead, grabbed its tongue as a rope, and quickly climbed to Dean's feet. They clung to Dean's calf and gnawed desperately. Damn it! Dean hurriedly bent down and stabbed with his dagger. Puff! The dagger pierced through the zombie's head. The zombie only cared about gnawing on his boots and didn't even try to dodge. When the head was pierced, the undead's palms immediately loosened and it fell vertically. At the same time, a gust of wind came, and then Dean felt that his feet were loose. He saw the undead holding his other leg fell down, leaving only its head still biting on his boots, and its mouth was still gnawing desperately. It didn't die. Dean's face changed slightly. He kicked the undead's temple, and its head flew out like a football. It fell in a parabolic trajectory into the group of undead below and was quickly submerged. On the ground, the place where he and Reynolds stood was now completely submerged by the undead. Thank you. Dean turned to Reynolds and said. It was him who helped. It's nothing, Reynolds said halfway. Suddenly, he was hit by something, and his body flew out dozens of meters backward. Dean's pupils shrank. He turned his head and suddenly saw that the thing that hit Reynolds was a rotten and ugly undead. At the moment, it was firmly grasping his body and gnawing desperately. Reynolds's face was red. He pushed it away with a burst of strength and kicked it in the stomach, making it fall vertically. Dean was relieved to see him out of danger. Then his face changed. He saw several figures flying from behind him at high speed in his peripheral vision. Whoosh! His body swayed quickly instinctively, almost brushing past the trajectory of a black shadow. His whole body was in a cold sweat. Sure enough, he couldn't be distracted at all. Rumble. Suddenly, there was a burst of roars on the ground. Dean's face changed slightly. He looked down and was stunned. He saw that the soil under the group of undead had cracked. The scene was very familiar. Sure enough, in the cracked soil, a huge figure slowly sat up. It was the giant god's corpse. Impossible. Reynolds flew to Dean's side. Seeing the giant god's corpse coming out of the ground, he was shocked. There's a second giant god's corpse guarding? How is it possible, this corpse king? Speaking of this, there was a loud bang in the distance. Dean and Reynolds were shocked by the noise. They turned their eyes and looked at the place where Haisha and Reynolds were fighting with the corpse king. A lot of dust was raised on the ground, and the sound of metal collision was heard from time to time in the dust. Roar! Just as the two of them were paying attention to the battle in front of them, the giant god's corpse sat up from the ground and let out a roar towards the sky. The tongue in its enormous mouth suddenly shot towards the two of them. The huge eyeballs and mouth on the tongue looked like a mass of flesh and blood that had merged with countless corpses. Not good. Reynolds' face changed, and he hurriedly said, "Go higher." He didn't wait for him to speak. When the giant god's corpse opened its mouth, he had a bad premonition. He increased his speed and flew up at full speed. Whoosh! The giant god's corpse's tongue ejected extremely fast as lightning. In the blink of an eye, it caught up to the feet of Dean and Reynolds. But the two reacted quickly and accelerated a rise. They were not caught by the thick and long tongue. In the blink of an eye, the two flew more than 300 meters in the sky. The undead on the ground looked like the size of ants. The giant god's corpse's tongue didn't touch the two. It quickly retracted and roared angrily at the sky. Reynolds was relieved and said to Dean, "Are you okay?" Dean shook his head slightly and glanced at the claw mark on his neck. He frowned and said, "Were you hurt by that undead?" Reynolds touched his neck and smiled. "It's just a scratch, not a bite. It won't get infected, but it's better to clean the wound." As he said, he reached for a small metal bottle from his waist bag and poured some white powder on his hand. He stretched his neck and applied the white powder to the wound on his neck. Dean glanced at the metal bottle in his hand and didn't say anything. When he was about to turn his head to look at Aisha's battlefield, he suddenly heard the wind coming. He couldn't help but look down. Suddenly, his pupils shrank. He saw 4 or 5 undead flying straight toward them. "Hi," Dean hurriedly said. At the same time, his figure swayed and hurriedly dodged a bloated undead rushing toward him. "What?" Reynolds was applying the white powder. When he heard Dean's voice, he was startled and looked down. He didn't see clearly, but the moment he bowed his head, his pupils were reflected by a ferocious face. His brain couldn't react at all. Bang! His body was suddenly hit and flew up. The metal bottle in his hand loosened involuntarily, and the white powder drifted out from the mouth of the bottle. Bang! When he was hit and flew upside down, another undead rushed straight to his waist. Suddenly, there was a burst of bone-cracking sound. Reynolds screamed in pain on the spot and spat out a mouthful of blood. "Reynolds!" Dean rushed over in a hurry. After the two undead hit Reynolds, they immediately hugged him tightly and madly gnawed his body. Reynolds endured the severe pain and raised his hand to push the undead that was hugging his chest. But the undead desperately rushed to his face like a madman. Its mouth was full of sharp teeth, and it stretched out its dark, rotten tongue, trying to hook his neck. "Get out, get out!" Reynolds roared and suddenly rolled his body. He rotated 720 degrees in the air and suddenly threw off the undead that hit his back. A viscous liquid quickly surged on his skin. The liquid quickly wrapped his body like running water. When it gathered in his chest, it quickly bulged and turned into a sharp knife. Puff! The sharp knife suddenly pierced the undead's body and penetrated its abdomen, but no blood flowed out. Such a serious injury had no effect on the undead. It still madly bit his head. Reynolds roared and suddenly raised his fist to hit the undead's head. Bang! The undead's head was suddenly broken. It was frozen on the neck in a strange, twisted posture, and its mouth was slightly open like a machine. Reynolds quickly punched it in the chest and threw it off his body. Dean breathed a sigh of relief when he saw that he was out of trouble, but he saw a few more black shadows flying from below. He suddenly saw that the giant god's corpse that sat up on the ground was grabbing the surrounding walking dead and throwing them at them. These flying walking corpses were all thrown by it. Whoosh! Dean's figure swayed and avoided an undead flying straight at him. He hurriedly turned his head to Reynolds and said, "It's too low here. We have to continue to rise." Reynolds panted slightly and said, "Remember, don't go higher than 800 meters. Otherwise, it will easily attract the attention of the Thunderbirds above the clouds. Once the Thunderbirds are attracted, all of us will die." Dee knew about this. He nodded slightly and quickly flew up at full speed. Reynolds also spread his wings and flew up. Whoosh! More than a dozen undead flew straight. They passed by Dean and Reynolds at an extremely fast speed. Reynolds flew sideways and avoided an undead. However, his dragon wings were too big. The wings were about 12 meters long. He didn't have time to dodge the edge of one of the dragon wings and was immediately hit by an undead. His body suddenly flew out and slid for dozens of meters before he stabilized his figure. But his wings were caught by the undead. Reynolds' face was ugly. His body rotated at an extremely fast speed. After a dozen consecutive laps, the undead finally fell. Reynolds was relieved. Just as he was about to continue to rise, he suddenly heard Dean shout, "Be careful." Reynolds' heart was cold. He quickly looked down, but saw nothing below. The giant god's corpse was grabbing the undead and hadn't thrown it over. "What's going on?" He was slightly startled. With a bang, his shoulder suddenly sank down, and a sharp pain came from his shoulder. He was horrified. He didn't have time to look up and took the lead to cut the top of his head with his sword. Clang! The sword cut something hard, making a sharp metal sound. The next moment, Reynolds felt that the world in front of him was spinning. His body was thrown out by a huge force. The sky was getting farther and farther under his feet. The sky? His pupils shrank. He hurriedly turned his head and suddenly saw the densely packed undead on the ground the size of ants were expanding rapidly. No, he was horrified. He hurriedly controlled the dragon wings to stabilize them. Crack! When the dragon wings forcibly reversed the wind, there was a cracking sound coming from the skeleton. Chapter 590. When Reynolds flapped his wings and rushed to the sky, he suddenly saw a black shadow falling at high speed. It was an undead with flesh under the armpit, diving straight toward him. Reynolds' face changed, and he suddenly thought that the force that was thrown down before was obviously from the hand of this undead. He gritted his teeth slightly, endured the severe pain on the dragon wing skeleton, and flew to the side, trying to avoid colliding with it. Bang! Suddenly, a sharp pain came from his back. The strong impact made Reynolds spit out a mouthful of blood on the spot, mixed with saliva splashing on his face. His pupils were about to crack. He only felt that his back was held by two sharp claws, and at the same time, there was a roar in his ears. There was an undead lying on his back. His flapping dragon wings were caught by this undead, and he was about to fall for a while. No, he watched the undead swooping down from the sky, and his pupils enlarged. Bang! The two suddenly collided with each other. All of this happened in the blink of an eye. The ribs in his chest suddenly let out a cracking sound, as if he had been hit by a meteorite. His brain buzzed, and the wind whistled in his ears. His body fell down at an extremely fast speed, and with a bang, he smashed into the ground, causing dust to fly up into his face and hair. Roar! 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 The roar came like a tide in an instant, and the sky was suddenly covered by darkness. Dean stared at Reynolds, who fell to the ground and was drowned by the undead. His heart was cold. He didn't expect that the pioneers were so weak that it was difficult to escape in front of the undead tide. Roar! The giant god's corpse suddenly roared, raised his giant hand and grabbed into the undead group. He held 2 or 3 undead in his palm. Some of the undead were caught at the edge and struggled to fall from his palm. He opened his hand and saw Reynolds, who was covered with blood, lying limp in his palm. He stretched out his huge tongue and licked, rolling the dying Reynolds into his mouth. After swallowing Reynolds, the giant god's corpse raised his head again, looked at Dean in the sky, and roared. He grabbed the surrounding undead and threw them again. Dean's face changed, and he hurriedly flew up. Whoosh, whoosh. One by one, the undead flew around his body. After the remaining force subsided, they fell again into the undead group below. In the blink of an eye, Dean had risen to a height of 500 meters. With the arm strength of the giant god's corpse, some of the undead thrown fell before they reached Dean's height. When he flew to about 600 meters, Dean stopped. He had long noticed that none of the undead thrown by the giant god's corpse could fly to such a height. This should be the limit of his arm strength. After throwing more than a dozen undead in a row, the giant god's corpse roared at the sky when he saw that he couldn't touch Dean. His huge eyes were filled with ferocity and anger. At this moment, the roar of a beast suddenly sounded from the other end of the battlefield. It spread like thunder in all directions and immediately caught Dean's attention. The source of the sound came from the direction of Aisha's battle. When Dean looked over, he was stunned. He saw 3 ferocious figures fighting fiercely in the air. Aisha's figure disappeared and was replaced by a humanoid dragon beast that was very similar to Hathaway's magic soldier state. Its whole body was covered with dark red scales, and there was a dragon tail of 7 or 8 meters long covered with bone spurs. 6 slender and sharp spikes protruded from the dark red feather-like dragon wings. There seemed to be small holes in the middle of the spikes, which were ejecting white-hot air. The upper body of this terrifying figure was Aisha's beautiful face. But at this moment, there were red patterns on her cheeks like grooves flowing with blood, and also like blood vessels protruding from her face. It looked strange and powerful. Compared with Hathaway's magic soldier state, Aisha's magic soldier state was bigger and more powerful. Seeing this scene, Dean couldn't help but recall Reynolds' words. He was a little shocked. He didn't expect that the Corpse King could actually force Aisha's magic soldier state. Bang! Bang! Aisha's figure swept extremely fast. Every time she rushed out, the spikes on her back would eject white-hot air like smoke. She was holding a blood-red giant sword in her claws. It was the big sword that she was always with. This giant sword with her original body looked a bit huge and uncoordinated. But at this moment, after her magic soldier state, it looked a little small and slender. When Aisha flew out, Dean couldn't see her figure in his sight. She disappeared directly. When she reappeared, she was already fighting with the Corpse King. The offensive was extremely fast. The blood-red giant sword was flying disorderly, like countless blood-red, lightning-dense net, completely covering the front of the Corpse King. However, the skeleton-like Corpse King with black wings on his back was not inferior. The dark spear in his hand danced in an airtight manner, blocking all of Aisha's moves. The sound of weapons clashing was continuous, and from time to time, there was a burst of fierce sparks splashing. At the same time, Hathaway went to the back of the Corpse King. Her spear was like a dragon, as fast as lightning, turning into hundreds of spear lights to stab the back of the Corpse King. In the front and back attack of the two, the Corpse King's defense was somewhat difficult. It was injured from time to time. It retreated step by step and was pressed into the low air. However, on the ground where the 3 people were fighting, there was a dark corpse tide gathered at the moment. It was like a group of madmen in a carnival. They raised their hands and danced wildly, trying to catch Aisha and Hathaway in the air. Roar! A roar suddenly sounded. Dean's face changed slightly. He looked down. The voice came from the mouth of the giant god's corpse. He saw it roar and slowly stand up from the ground. Its burly body was extremely huge. Every step it took on the ground made a rumbling sound. However, its walking speed was not fast. It It was like an ordinary person walking. But even so, under its huge body, every step it took was huge. Soon it came to the battlefield where the Corpse King was. Dean's face changed. The previous roar was most likely the Corpse King asking it to help. Damn it! Dean gritted his teeth slightly and clenched his fists. Looking at the fierce battle, his heart was a little nervous and worried. At the same time, he was a little angry and unwilling. Suddenly, an idea flashed in his heart. He immediately turned around and flew out of the corpse tide. Sister, that kid seems to have escaped. After cooperating with Aisha's attack and smashing the Corpse King into the corpse tide on the ground, Hathaway turned her head and glanced at Aisha. A cold light flashed in her eyes, and she said with a light smile. Aisha didn't look back and said indifferently, "You'd better concentrate. This Corpse King is not so easy to deal with. I'll pin it down in front, and you sneak attack from behind. Don't make any more mistakes. Do you understand?" Of course, I understand Sister's words. Hathaway smiled softly, her eyes like crescent moons. However, a big guy's coming. It's not so easy to deal with. Ignore it, Aisha said indifferently. Roar. With a roar, the Corpse King jumped out of the corpse tide on the ground and suddenly rushed toward Hathaway. Hathaway's face changed slightly. She hurriedly dodged and circled to Aisha's side. Aisha moved like lightning. The giant sword quickly blocked the Corpse King's black spear, followed by a storm of bloody sword slashes. It was as fast as lightning. If it was another monster, it would have already turned into dust under her attack. However, the Corpse King's black spear was extremely flexible. It blocked all the bloody sword slashes while retreating step by step. Only 1 or 2 light sword wounds appeared on its arm. Hathaway quickly circled to the back of the Corpse King. Just as she was about to attack, the giant god's corpse suddenly raised his hand and grabbed her. Hathaway's figure flickered, escaped from the giant palm like a butterfly, and continued to attack the Corpse King. At this moment, the weakness of the giant god's corpse was immediately reflected. Although the strength was great, the speed was extremely slow. It was as if the arm was pulled by countless silk threads. Every swing seemed exceptionally slow. Die. Hathaway dodged the giant god's corpse. Her wrist shook and the spear trembled instantly. It carried a rotating force like a spiral and suddenly stabbed the back of the Corpse King. When the tip of the spear was about to touch the back of the Corpse King, suddenly the flesh and blood on the back of the Corpse King squirmed. A mass of flesh and blood suddenly stretched out from it and hit the spear. With a bang, the mass of flesh and blood was instantly penetrated by the spear. The spiral force of the spear body drove the flesh and blood to rotate and twist. The surface of the flesh and blood was twisted like a screw. Hathaway was slightly startled. She felt a little strange. This flesh and blood was not broken. She felt bad in her heart and immediately pulled the spear. However, the spear body seemed to be sucked and could not be pulled. Whoosh! At the same time, the front end of the spiral-shaped flesh and blood suddenly extended at an extremely fast speed, swimming toward the spear shaft. The front end of the flesh and blood split open, and there were sharp teeth inside. They rushed toward Hathaway's face along the spear shaft. Hathaway's pupils shrank slightly. She suddenly shook the spear shaft in her hand. The strong vibration force immediately shook the flesh and blood. With a puff, the sharp spear head cut the flesh and blood. She found an opportunity to quickly swing the spear shaft and pull the spear out. At this moment, the flesh that was cut suddenly twisted and turned into a fist, quickly hitting her chest. With a bang, Hathaway could not dodge in time. Her body retreated violently and hit the zombies on the ground like a meteorite. The surrounding zombies immediately swarmed up as if they saw a hungry and thirsty animal. Dragon Flame. A high-pitched shout rang out, and the tide of corpses suddenly ignited into flames. Hathaway, who was submerged in flames, quickly rose into the air, and only when she was in midair did the flames extinguish from her body. This was the ability of her Demon Dragon Warrior's magic mark, to control flames. After entering the state of Demon Soldier, she could control the fat in her body to mix with the demon dragon warrior's carbon gas, and then ignite herself. In fact, any living creature had flammability. However, the biological characteristic of a demon dragon warrior was that it could autonomously control spontaneous combustion, just like a poisonous snake could control the venom in its body. Whoosh, whoosh. After releasing the dragon flame, Hathaway gasped softly, and cold sweat overflowed from her forehead. She stared at the zombie king who was fighting with Aisha, and her eyes flickered slightly. Roar! The giant god's corpse roared and grabbed Aisha again. Aisha looked down at it, and a trace of coldness flashed in her eyes. She said to Aisha, who was fighting with the zombie king, "I'll go and solve this eyesore first." After that, without waiting for Aisha's reply, she quickly swooped away and rushed to the giant god's corpse with her spear. Aisha's eyes sank, and she was no longer distracted. She attacked the zombie king with all her strength. Whoosh! At this time, a figure flew over the outer edge of the tide of zombies in the distance. It was Dean, who had previously left. The ground behind him rumbled, but it was a group of wolf-like monsters. Come on! Dean secretly encouraged this group of monsters in his heart. He had encountered this group of monsters before, but Eureka didn't want to waste his strength, so he didn't choose to kill them. Instead, he took a detour. This kind of gregarious monsters had always been territorial and would not leave easily, so he thought of attracting them. Although it might not have much effect, at least it could contain some zombies. Roar! This group of monsters had just rushed to the edge of the tide of zombies. Suddenly, the leader, nearly 4 meters tall, roared to the sky and stopped its momentum. Then it roared a few more times and suddenly turned around and ran away. Dean was stunned and a little dumbfounded. Ran away? Was it scared? Roar! When this group of monsters turned around and retreated, the zombies at the outer edge of the tide of zombies noticed them and immediately roared and chased after them. Dean breathed a sigh of relief. In any case, it played a little role. Boom! A huge roar suddenly came. Dean's heart jumped, and he suddenly turned his head to look. Suddenly, he saw the giant god's corpse rushing to the side of the zombie king, fell down, and smashed into the tide of zombies, immediately crushing a group of zombies. Dean was delighted. Soon, he noticed that it was not Aisha who killed the giant god's corpse, but Hathaway. Hathaway swung her spear and suddenly noticed a black spot floating in the distance. It was Dean, who had previously escaped. She was slightly stunned, and suddenly the corner of her mouth raised. Whoosh! Her figure moved, and she suddenly flew out. Attack its back! Aisha saw that Hathaway killed the giant god's corpse and immediately said to her. Hathaway smiled gently and flew past from his side. She tilted her head and said, "Good sister, I'll leave this zombie king to you. I don't want this credit. I'll go and deal with that damn brat first." Aisha was slightly stunned, and her pupils shrank suddenly. Whoosh! Hathaway's figure was like lightning. When her voice fell, she was already hundreds of meters away. Her figure flew fast and rushed straight to Dean like lightning. Dean saw Hathaway flying in the distance and couldn't help but be stunned. A bad premonition suddenly surged in his heart. He hurriedly turned around and ran, but not toward the outside of the tide of zombies, but toward the sky. Hathaway saw Dean flying high in the sky at high speed. She couldn't help but squint, and a trace of chill flashed through her eyes. Cunning boy, you're dead. If Dean ran far away, she could quickly catch up with him, but Dean flew to the sky. Apparently, he was aware of her intention and wanted to use the thunderbirds in the clouds to stop her. However, too slow. She flapped her wings with all her strength, like a rocket flying at high speed. When Dean had just flown about 700 meters, she caught up with him. Why don't you continue to fly? Hathaway flew a few meters above Dean, looked down at him, and said with a smile. Dean's face was ugly. Suddenly, he looked behind her and was stunned. He said, Zombie King. Chapter 591. Hathaway breathed a sigh of relief when she saw that there was nothing behind her. At the same time, a gust of wind rolled up. She looked back and saw Dean flapping his wings and flying to the sky at high speed. Humph! Hathaway snorted coldly. She flapped her wings and caught up with Dean in an instant. The time of turning her head was nothing to her. Even if she guessed that it might be Dean's escape strategy, for her, even if there was only a trace of possibility, it was worth it because the danger of the King of Corpses was far greater than Dean. Whoosh! Dean had just flown more than 10 meters away when Hathaway caught up with him again. After so long, you still haven't grown a bit. Hathaway indifferently looked at Dean and said, "In the face of absolute power, is your little trick meaningful?" "It's quite meaningful to me." Dean slightly gasped and looked at her coldly. "Why do you do this? You have already got what you want. Why do you still do this?" Hathaway gently smiled and didn't seem to be in a hurry to make a move. She said, "Do you still remember your captain, Ian?" "Ian?" Dean was startled. "Yes." Hathaway said, "He has already told me everything that happened during the mission. You were able to kill Eugene." "Not bad, not bad. With the heat of your body, you were able to kill Eugene, whose physique and fighting ability were stronger than yours. It should be because of the special ability of your magic mark. Such a powerful magic mark? Is it legendary?" Dean's heart tightened. He suddenly remembered that when he returned to the Shadow Hunter's cave, he didn't see Ian's body. It turned out that Ian didn't die at that time, but pretended to be dead. When a youth of Wing family chased them, he took the opportunity to run away. "Eugene is really your man." Dean's eyes flashed slightly and said in a deep voice, "I killed Eugene with the advantage of the surrounding environment and promised Ian a big benefit. He and several others also helped me, so I killed Eugene. Otherwise, I can't do it alone. As for the legendary magic mark you said, how is it possible? I was just a hunter in the Outer Wall before. It was very lucky to get a rare magic mark. Legendary magic mark, this kind of thing I don't even dare to think about. Great benefits? Yes, Eugene revealed his identity at that time. Ian and the others also knew that I had Aisha behind me. So I took the opportunity to use your sister's name to promise them benefits. Once the mission is over, I will restore their freedom and they won't step into the wasteland." Dudian said in a serious tone. Hathaway stared at Dean. After a moment, she smiled. "It's a pity. If I didn't know how cruel my punishment is, I'm afraid I would have believed your words." Dean was stunned. "Although I don't know how you got the legendary magic mark, your existence is an eyesore," Hathaway said with a smile. Dean's palms were overflowing with cold sweat. He looked over her shoulder and saw Aisha was entangled by the Corpse King. She was fighting fiercely while moving towards his side. "Hold them off," he thought to himself. "Are you thinking that you can be saved by delaying it?" Hathaway chuckled. Dean's pupils shrank, but he quickly concealed the strange look on his face. "I don't understand what you are talking about. If you want to kill me, then kill me. Why so much nonsense? But if you don't kill me, I am willing to exchange a secret with you." "Secret?" Hathaway looked at him with a smile. Dean nodded. "I know the trace of the Dream Breeder." "Oh." Hathaway's smile on her face was even thicker. "Where?" Dean saw her playful expression and didn't believe her. His heart sank, but he changed his mind and said, "Your sister also knows about this. When I stayed with her in the Orange Wasteland, we were looking for the Dream Breeder. Unfortunately, we didn't find him. Later, I heard that you came to the fortress, so your sister was ready to return to the fortress." Hathaway was startled. She frowned slightly. There was some surprise in her heart. Was what this kid said true? After she came to the fortress, she knew that Aisha had been missing for a long time. With Aisha's strength, no monster could keep her. Even if they could keep her, it was impossible to keep her for such a long time. Listening to Dean at this moment, there was a 70 to 80% possibility. However, she knew that Dean was cunning and could tell any lie. This matter was likely to be fabricated. However, if it was true, then after he killed this kid, the secret of the Dream Breeder would only be known to his sister. If she obtained the magic mark of the Dream Breeder, which was ranked first among the legendary monsters, then even if his bloodline awakened again in the future, he might not be able to catch up to her. Thinking of this, her heart was in a mess, and she frowned. Dean saw her appearance and knew that his plan worked. Although he was not familiar with Hathaway and naturally didn't know her weaknesses, at least he knew that defeating Aisha was her goal and weakness. Clang, clang. The sound of metal impact came from a distance and quickly approached. Dean looked at the corner of his eyes and suddenly saw that Aisha was chasing towards this side at a very fast speed. The Corpse King followed, chasing her all the way, while constantly attacking, forcing Aisha to turn around to parry. The flying speed of the Corpse King was not inferior to Aisha. Every time the broken black wings trembled, it could control the body to catch up with Aisha flexibly. Hey, Hathaway, who was frowning and contemplating, suddenly sighed. Her wrinkled eyebrows loosened, and her face returned to a smiling appearance. Seeing her like this, Dean's heart suddenly sank. Your overt plot really annoys me. Hathaway shook her head and smiled, saying, Sure enough, I can't let you speak, otherwise the situation of certain death may be saved by you. Speaking of this, she looked down at Aisha and the Corpse King who were flying over. The smile on her face slowly disappeared, saying, Do you know why I'm not in a hurry to kill you? Dean was startled. Suddenly, he thought of a possibility in his heart. This possibility made his whole body cold. Looking at Aisha, who was approaching at a very fast speed, there was a sense of panic in his heart. He hurriedly shouted, Don't pass. The word come hadn't come out of his mouth when suddenly his chest was shocked. An unparalleled force hit his chest in an instant. The bones that were healing suddenly broke and collapsed. Dean spurted a mouthful of blood, and his body flew back. He didn't fly for a few meters when he felt his shoulder was caught. It's too late to know now. Hathaway's eyes looked at him without the slightest emotion, indifferently said, Lowly person, pay the price of the weak. I hope this pain can accompany you to hell. After that, another dragon claw suddenly grabbed the wings on Dean's back and pulled hard. Puff sound. The translucent hard wings on Dean's back were suddenly pulled out from the flesh of his back. Blood splashed, and the wings with blood and tendons were thrown to the distance by her. They flew in the air and fell to the ground. Puff! There was another sound of flesh tearing. Dean's other wing was also pulled out and thrown away by her. Dean's eyes were cracked in pain. His body bent like a shrimp, and blue veins bulged on his forehead. He pressed his throat very low, not wanting to let Aisha hear, so as not to fall into Hathaway's trap. But despite this, the spasmodic pain on his back made him feel suffocated. After 2 low roars, he clenched his teeth, letting the roar stay in his chest. He panted, madly breathing and inhaling to relieve the pain on his back. Stop! Aisha roared angrily when she saw this scene. The scales on her body spewed out thick flames like a dragon burning with crimson devil flame. At the same time, the scales on her forehead suddenly ruptured. A sharp black horn slowly grew out from the inside and pierced towards the sky. Dark green meridians protruded from the skin at the end of the horn and spread to her entire forehead. It looked like some kind of ancient race's incantation. Bang! She threw her sword backhand and hit the black spear of the King of Corpses. Suddenly, there was a violent, buzzing sound, shaking the spear of the King of Corpses. At the same time, she quickly rushed to Hathaway. Hathaway's pupil shrank when she saw the black horn on her forehead. Third awakening? She quickly recovered, and her face was gloomy. No wonder the Dragon Mother is so biased. It turns out that you have really awakened to this degree. Sure enough, it's either you die or I die, humph. She raised her dragon claw and stabbed at Dean's heart. Whoosh! A gust of wind whistled past. Hathaway's face changed, and she hurriedly dodged. However, although she was prepared in her heart, she still barely dodged. She saw a bloody red light flew past her body. It was the bloody sword in Aisha's hand. At the same time, a strong pain came from behind her. She saw that her dragon tail, which was transformed from a magic weapon, was cut off. Blood gushed from the broken dragon tail, but the blood didn't flow for a long time. The cut surface of the wound quickly gushed out black matter, stopping the bleeding. During this moment of delay, Aisha's figure had approached at a very fast speed. Her wings and dragon tail cooperated with each other, and she rushed to Hathaway like a fish, raising her hand to grab Hathaway. Hathaway saw her rushing over, but she didn't panic. Instead, there was a smile on her face. The next moment, she grabbed Dean in her hand and threw him in another direction. Aisha couldn't help but look, and her face suddenly changed. She saw that the direction where Dean flew was in the direction of the King of Corpses. Damn it! She was angry in her heart, and her eyes were full of anger, but she couldn't attack Hathaway, who was close at hand. She turned and quickly chased Dean. Seeing Aisha turn away, Hathaway was relieved in her heart. Although she saw that in order to save Dean, she didn't hesitate to throw out her weapon. She was still not sure whether she would directly attack herself in anger. Now it seemed that Dean's position in her heart was obviously higher than she expected, which made her more satisfied. Whoosh! Aisha rushed out and chased after Dean. Dean endured the severe pain, looking at the black-winged Corpse King rushing in front and Aisha chasing from the side. He clenched his teeth and shouted, "Don't come over! Kill her and avenge me!" Aisha didn't hear it. Her eyes were fixed on his figure. The dragon wings were burning with flames, and she chased like a meteor. Dean saw her determined look, and there was a painful feeling in his heart. When his wings were pulled out, he knew that this was just Hathaway's means. The purpose was to irritate Aisha, and at this moment, he once again became her weapon to hurt Aisha. And he couldn't resist. When a strength is strong, it seems that it is enough to dominate a person's fate. Who can resist fate? Don't come over! Don't! Dean looked at Aisha, who was flying at full speed, and shouted desperately. When he was exhausted, he saw that Aisha's body did not stop at all, still flying straight, and he could not help but have a hot liquid in his eyes. Who? A whistling sound came, and the light suddenly darkened. Dean saw the body of the black-winged Corpse King rushing over, and he roared and opened the primary limitless state. White bones emerged all over his body, and he suddenly punched it in the cheek and roared, "Go to hell!" The black-winged Corpse King was expressionless, and his eyes were as black as ink, without a trace of white eyes, which looked a bit strange and terrible. When Dean punched, it suddenly shot, and the black spear suddenly stabbed out. With a bang, a flame suddenly hit from the side and swung the black spear away. The next moment, Dean saw a hot air wrapped around him, and his body flew back uncontrollably. He turned his head and saw that he was pulled by one of Aisha's hands and clamped under her armpit. At the moment, in her magic weapon state, Dean was like a 7- or 8-year-old child in her hand. Whoosh! Aisha flapped the dragon wings and quickly turned and flew away. The black-winged Corpse King quickly chased. A red and a black figure chased in the air at a high speed. However, although she entered the third awakening state, Aisha had an extra person in her hand, and the impact in the process of flying was not simply calculated by the weight of a person. The black-winged Corpse King behind her gradually got closer at a weak speed. Dean saw this and hurriedly said, "Leave me, it won't chase me." Aisha didn't answer. She looked straight ahead, and the dragon wings flapped quickly. Just when she was about to fly out of the corpse tide, suddenly a spear came from the sky. Puff! Aisha couldn't escape, and the dragon wings were pierced by the spear. "My good sister, how can you be so careless?" Hathaway's laughing voice came. After she was hit by a sneak attack, she didn't dare to stay and quickly turned and flew away. Dean was so angry that his body trembled. Hathaway's body swayed, and her speed slowed down a little. When she continued to fly after adjusting, a roar came from behind, and she saw that the black-winged Corpse King had caught up. Aisha suddenly turned around and dodged a black spear. When the spear retracted, she suddenly shot like lightning and grabbed the black spear. With a bang, her dragon claw palm grabbed the spear, and her tail curled and whipped toward the chest of the black-winged Corpse King. With a bang, she hit the chest of the black-winged Corpse King, and suddenly the broken armor on his chest was dented. The black-winged Corpse King roared angrily, and his arms exerted strength, struggling to pull. Aisha's face changed, and a flame suddenly burned on her arm. She took a deep breath, and her cheeks bulged slightly. She spat out a flame. The flame hit the face of the black-winged corpse king, and it immediately raised a hand to resist. Aisha took the opportunity to shake her palm, and the black spear trembled slightly, making people unable to hold it. However, when the palm of the black-winged corpse king was almost loosened, the tremor weakened, and it clasped the spear again. At the same time, the palm that resisted the flame was also grasped, and both hands worked together to pull the spear back. Aisha flew back for dozens of meters, and her face was ugly. She had just recovered from a serious injury, and she had not fully recovered to her peak state. She had used the body flame attack twice in this battle, which consumed a lot of physical strength. She had already felt exhausted. Chapter 592. Seeing that Hathaway had left, Aisha was relieved and decisively said, "I'll lead it away. You go first. Don't go back to the fortress. Keep going north. That's the direction of the giant wall." At the same time, she turned and swooped down like a meteorite. When she was close to the ground, she pushed with her palm. A soft force pushed Dean forward. He fell to the ground and rolled a few times before stopping. Dean was on the ground, looking up at Aisha's figure flying over his head. His heart was full of pain and embarrassment. He knew how dangerous it was for Aisha to lead the corpse king away alone. As a man, he didn't want to escape at this moment, but he had to hide here. He wanted to face life and death with her, but his reason told him that doing so would only drag her down and wipe out her only glimmer of hope. If he didn't have this damn reason, he would just desperately chase like a reckless man. Perhaps it would be more manly? His heart was full of pain and self-blame. He even had a feeling of hating himself. I can't do anything. I can't do anything. I'm just a burden, hiding here to live. How could I become such a person? How could I become such a waste? Dean clenched his palms tightly into the soil. He couldn't wait to climb up and fight with the corpse king. But his reason made his body lurk on the ground. His chest was close to the soil, and his hands were lying on the ground like a lizard. This posture could avoid attracting the attention of the corpse king as much as possible. And at the same time, he could move flexibly. Although he was angry to the extreme, he had to desperately endure under his reason. He clenched his teeth. His clear reason told him that rushing out would definitely kill him, and it would also implicate Aisha. However, there was another kind of thought in his heart, which made him feel extremely embarrassed. What reason? He was clearly cowardly. A cowardly person uses reason as an excuse. Dean roared hysterically and climbed up from the ground. His self-esteem could no longer bear such humiliation. Looking at the corpse king flying over his head and chasing Aisha, he picked up a stone from the ground and issued a tiger-like roar in its direction. The sound was deafening. There was only one thought in his mind. Since she could take the risk and even sacrifice herself for me, why couldn't I sacrifice myself and lure the undead king away for her? Compromising was for the sake of survival. But I want to live. Come here, you beast! Dean roared at the sky, his eyes red, holding the stone, opened his arms like a madman, roared at the back of the corpse king. Come on! The fiery roar was filled with shocking penetrative power and traveled thousands of meters away. Aisha, who was flying forward at a very fast speed, suddenly heard Dean's roar. She couldn't help but look stunned. She turned around and saw Dean climbing up from the ground and roaring at the corpse king behind him. She was startled, and suddenly there was a trace of warm liquid flowing in her eyes. Her teeth bit her lips, and her face slowly bloomed with a smile. The corpse king chasing behind Aisha didn't hear it. It didn't care about Dean's roar and went straight to the back of Aisha. When Dean saw this, he was so angry that his eyes were about to crack. His whole body's flesh and blood surface bulged with white bones. He clenched his fist and threw it toward its back. Whoosh! The stone crossed the air behind the corpse king and didn't hit it. Although the flying speed of the thrown stone could barely keep up with the speed of the corpse king, It was just like the speed of a person running. It was absolutely impossible to keep up with the speed of throwing an object, but the power carried by the throwing speed was reduced very quickly. It fell down before it could catch up with the Corpse King. Dean bit his teeth and bent down to pick up another stone from the ground, ready to catch up. At this moment, the Corpse King, who was chasing Aisha, suddenly turned around. Dean was startled, and then his heart was happy. He shouted, "Come here, beast. Don't you want to eat people? Come and eat me." He threw the stone in his hand at it again. Whoosh! The stone flew to the Corpse King's feet and fell down. Corpse King's expressionless black eyes seemed to suddenly flash a cold light. Its body suddenly swooped down, flying toward Dean at an extremely fast speed. Not good. Seeing that the Corpse King was attracted by Dean, Aisha was a little shocked. Her face suddenly changed. She hurriedly stopped the momentum and turned to chase at full speed. Dean's face changed slightly when he saw it chasing. There was a trembling feeling in his heart. It was false to say that he was not afraid of death, but now he was powerless to change it. Suddenly, he felt that his heart was full of regret. There were too many things he hadn't done yet. Too many wishes hadn't been fulfilled. Too many enemies hadn't paid the price. Too many. Too many. When he stood in the same place with regret in his heart, he suddenly saw Aisha behind the Corpse King flying back at full speed. He was startled, and his face changed immediately. He hurriedly shouted, "Don't come over! You run away!" Aisha's eyes were determined. She flapped her dragon wings at full speed, and her body gradually got closer to the Corpse King. Whoosh! Suddenly, there was a sound of wind, and the black-winged Corpse King, who was flying back to Dean, suddenly stopped, and in a flash, he suddenly turned around, and the black spear in his hand buzzed, like a black lightning rushing out. Puff! Blood sputtered in the air. The black spear ran through the abdomen of Aisha, who was chasing at full speed, and penetrated the dragon scales on her back. The dark clouds in the sky suddenly seemed to be silent. Time quietly stagnated. Dean stood on the ground, looking at the scene incredulously. He felt like his head had exploded, and there was a blank. The next moment, an indescribable anger and terrible killing intent burned from his heart. His whole body was like a burning flame that was about to burst. His throat seemed to explode with a roar. His eyes were red. The white bones of his whole body grew wildly, and the bones protruded with ferocious spikes, wrapping his body like a devil in hell. Why? Why even you? Even you want to use me? Why? Bang! With a low roar, he stomped on the ground, and with a bang, the ground cracked. His body used the force to bounce like a cannonball towards the zombie king. When he got close to its back, his red eyes were bloodshot, and with a roar, he punched the back of the zombie king's head. Go to hell. Bang! The black-winged Corpse King's body did not move, and the back of its head resisted Dean's punch without a tremor. But Dean's attack still attracted its attention. It slightly tilted its head, and its pure black eyes looked at Dean indifferently. A flesh and blood ejected from its back. Bang! It hit Dean's chest in an instant. The sound of bones breaking suddenly sounded. His body fell down like a meteorite, slanting straight into the ground, making a roar and raising countless dust. The severe pain of the broken chest bones made Dean's anger to the extreme, and he was a little sober. He couldn't help but cough and spit out a mouthful of blood, which seemed to be mixed with some pieces of internal organs. He gritted his teeth, climbed up from the ground, looked up at the black-winged Corpse King in midair, bent his knees slightly, and was about to bounce again. Suddenly, there was a whistling sound, and a red shadow flashed past. He saw Aisha's demonized dragon tail suddenly raised, whipping on the black-winged Corpse King's chest, and the heavy force instantly knocked its body away. While the black-winged Corpse King flew upside down, the black spear held tightly was pulled out from Aisha's abdomen again, bringing a sprinkling of blood. Aisha coughed lightly, reached out to cover the wound on her abdomen, turned her head and glanced at Dean in the dust on the ground. Seeing that he could still climb up, she was a little relieved, looked up at the black-winged Corpse King, took a deep breath, and suddenly turned and flew away. The black-winged corpse king quietly looked at her leaving back, suddenly turned around, and rushed toward Dean on the ground with the black spear in his hand. Dean saw that Aisha was not dead, and the killing intention in his red eyes faded slightly. After a moment, he saw the black-winged corpse king killing again, and the anger in his heart was ignited again, and he roared and jumped to meet it. Bang! Suddenly, the body of the black-winged corpse king that swooped down at an extremely fast speed suddenly trembled, and a scarlet dragon tail whipped on its back. The strong force made its body tremble, and it fell vertically toward the ground. With a loud bang, it raised a burst of roar. Go! Aisha quickly flew toward Dean, pulled his wrist, turned, and flew away at top speed. Dean was held by her. He looked down at the black-winged corpse king that fell to the ground. Seeing that it was not seriously injured and it climbed up again, he couldn't help but be anxious. He said to Aisha, "You let me go. If you go on like this, we will both die. It already knows that if it attacks me, you will come to help. It wants to use me to attack you. We don't fall into the trap of this brainless walking dead. I won't leave you behind," Aisha said with a tone of non-negotiable. Dean was anxious and angry and said, "You want to die together, but I don't want to die together. Get out of here. I'm upset when I see you. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't end up like this. Get out of here." Aisha was slightly stunned and looked down at him. When she collided with Dean's eyes, her expression returned to calmness. She looked up and continued to fly forward, saying, "No matter what you say, I won't leave you. I always do what I say." Hearing her say so, Dean was even more anxious. At this moment, the whistling sound came from behind. He glanced at the corner of his eyes and suddenly saw the black-winged corpse king flying again, and the speed was extremely fast. "It's coming," Dean hurriedly said. "Leave me. I'm begging you." Whoosh! As he spoke, the black-winged corpse king approached quickly, and the spear suddenly pierced out. Aisha had been aware of it, and the dragon tail swung away the spear. However, the spear that was knocked away turned a tricky arc and slammed toward Dean, who she was holding. Aisha's face changed, and she hurriedly wrapped Dean with her dragon wings. With a puff, the dragon wings were suddenly pierced, and the spear pierced into Dean's arm. Dean was afraid that she would be distracted, so he clenched his teeth in pain and did not groan. Aisha took the opportunity to swing the dragon tail, wrapped the leg of the black-winged corpse king, and struggled to throw it out. The black-winged corpse king's body was thrown back, and the spear was pulled out from Dean's arm and dragon wings. It quickly stabilized its momentum and chased again. Aisha's dragon wings were damaged, and she immediately lowered her height and flew toward the ground. If she fought in midair, she was no longer as flexible as the black-winged corpse king. She could only have a glimmer of life on the land. At a height of 20 or 30 meters from the ground, she pushed Dean out and then turned her body, driving the dragon tail to the back, sweeping the black-winged corpse king's spear again, and at the same time opening the distance. The black-winged corpse king growled, and this time he did not chase Dean, but went straight to Aisha, and the speed was very fast. Aisha's face changed slightly, and she suddenly stretched out her dragon claws. With a clang, she blocked its spear, and the other dragon claws quickly grabbed its neck. The black-winged corpse king reacted very quickly, raising his body and kicking toward Aisha's injured abdomen. When Aisha dodged, he suddenly turned around and kicked Aisha's arm, and the heavy force suddenly hit Aisha to the side. Dean saw that Aisha was completely at a disadvantage, and he knew that she had consumed too much physical strength. He was angry and anxious. He grabbed the dagger from the leggings and picked up the stone on the ground with the other hand. When he aimed at the corpse king, he threw it at it. The black-winged corpse king completely ignored the stone that was thrown, and he launched a fierce attack on Aisha. Dean saw that the stone hit it and shattered, but it could not cause any harm. He was anxious. He suddenly thought of it. He picked up a stone again, aimed at the trajectory of its attack, quickly predicted it, and threw it at its head. With a bang, the prediction actually worked, and the stone actually hit the head of the black-winged corpse king. The stone burst on the spot, and a lot of the sputtering powder shot into its eye sockets. The black-winged corpse king blinked slightly, as if to squeeze out the sand in his eyes. Aisha got a gap and quickly exerted her full strength, waving 2 dragon claws and cutting horizontally toward its neck. The black-winged corpse king growled and suddenly raised the spear, blocking the top of her head, holding her hands. A fierce battle, like lightning, instantly became a static competition of strength. Dean saw this and hurriedly kept throwing stones. The stone fell on the black-winged corpse king and burst into powder, but it did not distract it at all. Aisha clenched her teeth, and a dark red color slowly flowed out of the scales on her arm. She wanted to urge the third body flame. However, the body fat and the power of the magic soldier were not enough to release it again. In a few seconds of stalemate, a black shadow suddenly flashed. Puff! A palm pierced into Aisha's abdomen from Aisha. Aisha looked down in a daze, and suddenly saw that on the chest of the black-winged corpse king, there was a third arm, which was an arm made of flesh and blood. Soon, the severe pain in her abdomen instantly pulled out the strength of her body completely, and the arm was loosened involuntarily. At the same time, the arm that penetrated her abdomen quickly retracted, and the palm grabbed a few lumps of flesh and internal organs. No! Dean's eyes were cracked. The black-winged corpse king waved the spear with both hands and whipped Aisha's shoulder like a stick. With a bang, her body suddenly fell to the ground. Aisha coughed up blood and looked at Dean on the ground, and her lips moved slightly. Dean saw her mouth shape, which was saying, "Run away." No! Dean roared up to the sky, rushed up, and caught her fast-falling body high. However, a huge force came from her body, and Dean's body fell quickly together with her. With a bang, he fell to the ground. Dean seemed to have completely forgotten the pain in his body. He tightly hugged her body, his eyes red, and reached out to cover the hole in her abdomen. He still held a glimmer of hope and said, Quickly use the dragon blood to stop the bleeding. The wound will heal soon. Quick, run." Aisha opened her mouth slightly, and her voice was a little hoarse and weak. "Stop the bleeding." Dean screamed wildly. Puff! Suddenly, Aisha's body trembled, and at the same time, Dean was also stunned. He saw behind Aisha, the black-winged corpse king landed, holding the end of the black spear in his hand, and the front of the spear penetrated from Aisha's back and directly hit Dean, who was holding Aisha. Dean felt that his abdomen was pierced by a cold, hard object, and his stomach seemed to be empty in an instant. There was an indescribable sense of emptiness, followed by a strong, tearing pain. He looked into his arms and suddenly saw the pure black spear, which penetrated from Aisha's chest and connected to his abdomen. No. His brain was buzzing as if time and space were shaking, and his thoughts were blank and chaotic to the extreme. Thump, thump. He could hear the violent beating of his heart coming from his chest, contracting and expanding violently. At this time, Dean felt that the cold, hard object in his abdomen was slowly twitching, trying to pull out from his abdomen. He slowly raised his head and looked at the black-winged corpse king behind Aisha. What greeted him was a pair of pure black, cold, and emotionless eyes. Whoosh! Suddenly, a bloody shadow flashed past. The next moment, on the neck of the black-winged corpse king, a blood-colored thin line suddenly appeared. Then, this blood-colored thin line became thicker and thicker. At the same time, the black-winged corpse king's head slid slightly and slowly fell from the neck. The cut surface was neat, and there was no blood flowing out. Dean was stunned. This scene came too suddenly, without warning, and he didn't react at all. At this time, a violent cough sounded, and Dean couldn't help but look down. He saw that Aisha coughed with blood on her face, and many pieces of internal organs fell on her neck when she coughed, warm and slippery. Fourth awakening. Unfortunately, the awakening is too late. Aisha's mouth twitched slightly, revealing a bitter smile. Dean was slightly stunned, and suddenly noticed that on her tail that fell to the side, a bloody blade protruded, like the barb on the tail of a scorpion. Is this the one that just cut off the head of the Blackwing Corpse King? At this time, Dean felt that the body of Aisha in his arms flowed slightly and slowly became light. He saw that the demonic dragon armor on her body quickly faded, shrinking like a tide, and the dragon scales, dragon tail, and dragon horns on her body, which were composed of bloody mucus, gradually disappeared in the fading of bloody mucus, revealing her original beautiful cheeks and slender body. However, without the cover of the scales, her face was a little pale and bloodless. Dean's heart was extremely painful. "I hurt you again. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. You hold on a little longer, and I'll find a way to treat you right away." Aisha's lips moved slightly. Her voice was very light, and it seemed extremely weak, but her tone was very soft. She said, "It doesn't matter. You talk with me first." Dean's heart was sour, and there was a warm flow in his eyes. He held back his tears and said, "I will talk with you. You immediately used the dragon blood to treat the wound. This is just a small injury. It will be fine." Speaking of this, the tears couldn't help but flow out. The heart was pierced. Such a serious injury, even a pioneer would die. It was very beyond common sense that she could persist until now and still talk. Hearing Dean's words, Aisha's pale cheeks showed a faint smile, and there was a trace of reminiscence in her eyes. She said, "If this is my end, I don't regret it." Dean's heart was shocked, and his voice seemed to be drowned in tears. He asked hoarsely why. Aisha gazed at him with a smile and said, "Because the days with you were the happiest days of my life. I really want to go back to that small ice cave. Just the two of us, living there every day. Even if it's a lifetime." I cough. "I won't get tired of it." Dean's eyes were moist, and his vision was blurred by the tears. He raised his hand and wiped the blood that was coughing out of Aisha's mouth at the same time. He said, "Don't talk anymore. When your injury is healed, I'll take you back to that place. We won't do anything. We'll live there together. Just the two of us. Stop the bleeding immediately. When your injury is healed, we'll go." Aisha's mouth showed a trace of smile. A man's words should be kept. Of course. Dean nodded hard, but the tears couldn't stop flowing out. Aisha smiled, and suddenly her brows twisted. She seemed to be in a bit of pain, but soon her brows relaxed again. Just as she was about to speak, her throat suddenly swelled, and she suddenly coughed out a few finger-sized lumps of flesh and blood. "No, don't talk anymore." Dean's eyes were red. Aisha gently took a breath and seemed to recover a little strength. She said weakly, "Don't hate Hathaway. Don't avenge me. You can't fight them. I hope you can live well, okay?" Dean heard her mention Hathaway, and the killing intent in his heart instantly gushed out, making him crazy. He gritted his teeth and said, "I'll live well. I'll live well. I must live well. No, promise me, don't avenge me." Aisha saw his face full of killing intent and couldn't help but be anxious. She spoke too fast and suddenly pulled her injury, causing her to cough violently. Dean suddenly sobered up and said in a panic, "Don't worry. I promise you anything. Don't worry. I promise you everything. Don't worry. Speak slowly." Seeing the panic on Dean's face, Aisha was relieved. Then she felt that her vision was a little blurred, probably because of too much bleeding. Thinking of this, she suddenly felt a trace of reluctance, but at the same time, there was a feeling of relief. "Promise me one more thing, okay?" She reluctantly moved her eyes, trying to see Dean's face clearly. Promise me 100 things," Dean said nervously. Aisha tried hard to make a smile on her face and maintained her best appearance. She whispered, "Even if everyone forgets me, don't forget me, okay?" Dean felt pain in his heart like being pricked by a needle. He tightly clenched his teeth and said, "No, I won't forget you. Even if I forget everyone, I won't forget you." Aisha wanted to smile, but the corners of her mouth didn't move. She felt that her strength was getting weaker and weaker, and even opening her eyelids was a little difficult. She slightly gasped and gathered the last of her strength to look at him. Her blurred vision suddenly became a lot clearer. Looking at Dean's heart-wrenching look, she felt pity in her heart. She whispered, "Don't be sad, don't cry. Smile for me." Looking at the gradually dimming, moist look in her eyes, Dean had a strong sense of fear, as if something precious was about to be lost. He knew what this feeling was and what would happen next. But seeing the quiet smile on her pale cheeks, he finally held back his grief and slowly grinned, showing a smile. Although his face was full of tears at this moment, the smile was extremely bright. It seemed that he had used all the smiles in his life at this moment, as if he knew that he would never smile again in the rest of his life. He grinned and tried to maintain the smile. He realized that Aisha hadn't opened her mouth for a long time. She hadn't opened her mouth for a long time. In an instant, the sunny smile on his face disappeared in an instant, as if it was swallowed by darkness. The next moment, on the ground of this wilderness, an extremely sad roar suddenly broke out, resounding in all directions. Chapter 593. The lead gray clouds that were full of nuclear dust hovered in the sky, quietly like a cluster of thick ink that could not be melted. They filtered the sunlight outside the atmosphere and sprinkled the dirty and desolate shimmer on the wilderness. The breeze hovered silently, no longer with the previous sharp, whistling momentum. The wind blew away the bloody smell in the air, as if nothing had happened, and the world was quiet. The never-ending howls of grief and anger in the wilderness gradually grew hoarse and stopped. Dean held Aisha's body tightly, sobbing like a sad beast, with countless prayers in his heart, but the gods who looked down on the common people seemed to ignore his pleas. Slowly, he felt that he had no strength to cry. All the tears that flowed out were like his consciousness and soul, and his body was all hollowed out. He felt dizzy, as if the soul was stripped from the body. Without the soul, what is left of a person? Is there only an empty shell? Or is there a new substance, replacing the soul, occupying this body? Tears dried on Dean's face. He silently hugged her, staring at her gentle and quiet face as if she was sleeping. "Katja! Katja!" Suddenly, a burst of subtle gnawing sound slowly pulled Dean's sight. His dull eyes recovered a trace of vitality. He raised his head and looked along the source of the sound. In the next moment, his face, which was already numb, suddenly revealed an intense change. Extreme hatred and rage caused his face to become completely distorted. He saw that the place where the movement came from was from one of Aisha's feet. At her calf, there was a head biting on it, and it was constantly gnawing. It was the head of the black-winged corpse king who had been beheaded before. "Ah, go to hell!" Dean rushed over like crazy in an instant. He clamped the head of the black-winged dead king with both hands, pulled it from Aisha's calf, pressed it on the ground next to him, raised his fist and smashed it wildly, and shouted wildly in his mouth. Every punch was full of strength, so that the fingers on the fist were broken, and he didn't feel it. After hundreds of continuous hammering, the bones of his hands had been broken in large areas, and the strong pain stimulated his consciousness to gradually recover a little. He stopped, and his chest was violently undulating. While gasping, he looked at the head of the black-winged dead king. He was angry to find that its skull was not dented at all, but his fist was seriously damaged, and he paid a heavy price. "Go to hell!" He roared, grabbed its hair, and smashed it to the ground. After hammering dozens of times in a row, he was so tired that he stopped. He saw that the soil on the ground was smashed into a deep pit, and the sand poured into the nostrils and mouth of the black-winged corpse king, but its face was still unharmed. Dean was angry and sad in his heart. Too weak, he was so weak that he couldn't kill it, even if the other party only had a head left. He pressed down on its head and took a deep breath. The anger in his heart slowly calmed down. Then he slowly urged the energy in his body and entered the primary limitless state. His white bones bulged, and soon his crippled hands slowly healed. The broken bones were glued back together and restored to their original state. He pulled out the dagger on his leg and turned the head of the black-winged dead king upside down. Suddenly, he saw the cut under its head, and the wound was covered with a layer of dark red scale-like cuticle. He reached out and touched it. It felt extremely tough, and the cuticle of this dark red scale was a bit like the demonized dragon scales he had seen on Aisha before. He thought of the picture of it biting Aisha's calf before, and at the same time, he remembered that before Aisha died, she had frowned and showed a trace of pain. Could it be that at that time it bit her? But at that time, she was still in the demonized state. That is to say, it ate her demonized dragon scales at that time and absorbed them, which led to the same scars or demonized dragon scales on its wound. You really deserve to die. Dean's body trembled slightly, clenched the dagger, and stabbed it into its eye socket. Puff, the eye socket of the black-winged dead king, was suddenly pierced by the dagger, and the blood overflowed from the eye socket. Although its skull was extremely hard, the eyeball was weak after all, which had nothing to do with the physique. The structure of the eyeball itself was doomed to be incomparable with the scales. Do you think I really can't kill you? Don't you like to eat? Eat? Dean's face was ferocious, holding the end of the dagger, rotating in the eye socket of the dead king. At the same time, with his knee against its head, the other hand grabbed the soil and stones from the ground and stuffed them into its mouth. When his dagger was rotating, suddenly a high-pitched scream came out of the mouth of the black-winged dead king, which was extremely clear and harsh. Dean's eardrums were hurt by the scream, and there was a kind of pain of the magic sound drilling into his brain. He clenched his teeth, stabbed the dagger into the depths of its head, and then struggled to shake it left and right. While stirring, he felt that the brain tissue in its head was extremely tough, and the resistance when cutting was great. The scream of the black-winged dead king suddenly stopped, and the slightly open mouth froze, completely motionless. Die, die, die. Dean did not stop here, still desperately stirring the dagger, wishing to stir it into a lump of mud, leaving no inch of intact tissue. Rumble. Suddenly, there was a slight tremor on the ground. Dean suddenly woke up and looked up. He saw a dark figure rushing in the distance. Most of them were humanoid, with different heights. It was the corpse tide that had been shaken off before. His face changed slightly, but he did not panic. He quickly stirred his hand and cut the facial muscles of the black-winged dead king. He used his fingers to dig from its eye socket, and suddenly pulled out a piece of cold, dark brain tissue, a bit like powder residue, not sticky. He quickly smeared it on himself and on the armor of Aisha next to him. At this time, he saw that the silver metal belt behind Aisha was still tied with a waist bag. He immediately removed it and untied it. He saw a lot of metal bottles and cans inside, including a bottle of submerged corpse powder. He quickly unscrewed the bottle. There was some light blue powder inside. He immediately sprinkled it on himself and Aisha's body. He had seen this thing in the books of the fortress. It was more expensive than the Walking Dead powder. It could cover up its own smell to a great extent. Even a higher-level Walking Dead was difficult to detect. At the same time, the powder was mixed with the tissues of some high-level Walking Dead, so that the ordinary Walking Dead smelled it and would automatically stay away. With this submerged corpse powder, plus the brain of the black-winged dead king, Dean believed that he could escape the corpse tide. At this time, he also understood that the previous scream of the black-winged dead king was not a painful scream, mostly to summon the corpse tide. Rumble. As the tide of corpses gradually approached in the distance, the tremor of the ground became more and more intense. Dean's movements were calm. He tore a string of cloth from his body and pierced the other eye of the king of corpses. He tied the cloth from its two eye sockets and tied it to his waist. He wanted to keep this thing and humiliate it in the future. Even though the corpse king had no consciousness, was already dead, and didn't know pain or humiliation, the hatred and anger in his heart wouldn't stop here. After tying it, he bent down to pick up Aisha on the ground and quickly ran away. Rumble. The corpse tide gradually slowed down and stopped at the body of the black-winged dead king. The corpse tide, which was as neat as an army, soon loosened after stopping. Like soldiers who had lost their orders, became scattered sand, wandering separately, and did not chase Dean. After running for 4 or 5 miles, he gradually stopped and came to a pile of stones to sit down. He gently put Aisha on the ground, gasping and staring at her face. Chapter 594. Is it my illusion? Dean was stunned, and then reacted. His heart suddenly pounded wildly. He slightly held his breath, opened his eyes wide, and stared at her sleeping face. There was an unprecedented sense of tension. Time stood still at this moment, until Dean saw her eyelashes tremble slightly, as if she was about to wake up. Dean only felt a slight tremor in his mind, and the blood in his whole body seemed to boil in an instant. He was so excited that his pores opened, and his fingers involuntarily clenched. It's not an illusion, it's real. She really moved. Dean was so excited that he wanted to jump and shout, but he held back. He suppressed his rapid breathing, carefully and gently approached her, and once again carefully looked at her face. Aisha's eyelids trembled slightly, as if she was about to open her eyes. Seeing such a reaction, Dean was so excited that his heart was about to burst. He was more excited and grateful than if he had received the whole world. His body trembled slightly, and he felt that there was suddenly a hot liquid flowing out of his eyes, blurring his vision. He quickly raised his hand to wipe it away, and then opened his eyes wide so that he could see her more carefully and clearly. At this time, Aisha's eyebrows trembled slightly, as if she was frowning, but also as if she was enduring something. Seeing this, Dean suddenly sobered up, and suddenly thought of the wound on her chest. He immediately looked at it and was stunned. He saw that the bowl-sized wound on her chest had disappeared at this moment, and it had healed itself. Only the hole in the breastplate seemed to prove that the previous wound was not an illusion. Is it her self-healing ability? Dean suddenly thought of this, and his heart could not help but secretly rejoice. At this time, he noticed that Aisha's fingers were trembling slightly, as if she was about to regain consciousness. When he noticed her trembling fingers, he suddenly saw that her fingernails were slowly growing in a subtle range. The original shell-like fingernails had become more and more slender, and the front of the fingernails was pulled forward, becoming a little sharp. On her white arms, faint dark marks slowly appeared, as if the hidden blood vessels in the skin were revealed. But the color of these blood vessels was not dark red, but deep pure black. Dean was slightly startled, and could not help but glance at other parts of her body. Soon he found that in addition to her arms, her neck also slowly appeared pure black lines like blood vessels. Could it be a secret technique of a dragon clan? This doubt appeared in his heart, and at the same time, an even more terrifying thought appeared in his mind. However, he suppressed it and did not dare to think about it. However, the excitement in his heart slowly subsided and was replaced by nervousness. Suddenly, he thought of a way to completely erase the suppressed terrible thoughts. He immediately narrowed his pupils and looked at Aisha with his thermal vision. He saw that Aisha was lying in front of him. Her body didn't have the slightest heat reaction. It must be known that her demon dragon mark wasn't a cold-blooded demonic creature. Unless she deliberately concealed it, her body would emit a powerful heat source. But at this moment, there was no such thing. How could this be? Why was this happening? Dean's face became ugly. He slowly leaned down and put his ear gently on her chest for fear of pressing her, and then listened to her heartbeat. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Half a minute passed, but Dean didn't hear a beat. How could this be? Could it be that she was using the dragon blood art to suppress it? Yes, it must be like this. He gasped and looked up at the girl again. In a blink of an eye, her face also protruded with dark black lines. The shape was very similar to the meridians, which was particularly conspicuous under the snow-white skin. He looked down and saw that her nails were still growing. In a blink of an eye, they were an inch long from her fingers, and they were extremely sharp. No, it can't be. He gasped slightly and raised his hand to slap his head. The pain seemed to dispel the distractions in his mind. He gritted his teeth and slowly raised his hand to her eyes. When his fingers were just about to hold up her eyelids, Aisha, who was sleeping, suddenly opened her eyes, and there seemed to be two cold black lights flashing. Dean's fingers were stiff, and the next moment his whole body was stiff, because he saw that Aisha's eyes had turned into pure black eye sockets without the white of the eyes. This kind of hair-raising eyes made two words appear in his mind in an instant. Corpse King. The black-winged Corpse King, who was killed before, had such eyes exactly the same. No, it's not like this. Dean's body trembled slightly, and tears flowed from his eyes. When he saw her opening her pure black eyes and looking at himself, his face immediately held up a tearful smile, just as the girl had hoped to see before, a brilliant smile. "You woke up. I knew you would be fine." Dean grinned and said as if nothing had happened. After his voice came out, Aisha, who was just looking at him, suddenly sat up from the ground and made a hoarse and low roar in her throat. There was no soft woman's voice at all, but like a beast. While roaring, his hands quickly grabbed Dean and instantly threw him to the ground. He turned over and rode on Dean's body, opening his mouth to bite Dean. Dean didn't respond at all, and he didn't even think about responding. When he was pressed to the ground, he looked at Aisha, who was pouncing on him. He opened her mouth and saw that her snow-white teeth had become a bit sharp, especially the canines on both sides. They were like short and sharp bamboo shoots. Tears filled his eyes, and he had a feeling of wanting to cry. Aisha bit toward his throat. When she was about to bite, she suddenly stopped, but she didn't stop by herself, but on her neck, there were two hands tightly covering and pushing upward. Dean burst into tears. He held her neck tightly and lifted her up as if he was lifting a heavy mountain. Roar. Aisha's mouth desperately bit down. It was as if she smelled the tempting blood. There was a kind of impatient thirst which made her mouth open wide. Her originally beautiful cheeks were somewhat distorted. She was like a beautiful butterfly which was torn apart alive. There was no longer the previous beauty. "No, don't do this," Dean cried in his heart, looking at her pleading, like a humble insect showing the most sad and weak appearance. Roar. Aisha's beautiful face was incomparably fierce, and her sharp teeth dripped mucus. She twisted her nose, trying to break away from Dean's hands, and there was only bloodthirsty desire in her pure black eyes. Looking at the bloodthirsty face, Dean couldn't help but roar in grief. "Why? Why are you like this? What is despair? Do you want to destroy your most precious things with your own hands? Why does fate tease people like this?" In Dean's sad voice, Aisha's strength gradually gained the upper hand, and her ferocious cheeks were getting closer and closer. Puff! Her mouth fiercely bit something, but it was Dean's left hand that was blocking. Aisha bit his left hand like a lion, shaking her head left and right, desperately biting. Dean looked at her face, which was close at hand, full of craziness. There was no half of the previous gentleness and familiarity, only the killing intent to eat and swallow him. Does she really want to kill me? No, this is not her. Why? She is already dead. Why does fate still torture her like this? Dean cried bitterly. He couldn't help but remember in his heart. The girl weakly but gently said to him, "Even if everyone forget me, don't forget me, okay? Yes, I won't forget. I will always remember your most beautiful appearance." He roared madly. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.